Hello there, everyone. Okay, so today I'm going to go through something, if I can, that is a little interesting to me specifically and a little different from my usual content because generally when it comes to guides, ranking, etc., I try to stay objective to a point. And of course, something like a tier list has inherently subjective elements, even if some things can be said for certain. But with Arc 1 specifically, so again, this is of course an Arc 1 tier list, so not covering the Arc 2 Astral Rain content and not covering D-Tide. You know, Arc 1 has a different balance, and in some ways, indisputably is worse balanced overall, right? But the nice thing about something being a little less balanced is that you can more easily make a somewhat accurate tier list for it. Okay, so without further ado, with this beautiful PowerPoint I made in 5 minutes, just to go through the parameters, basically. So why even bother making a tier list? Well, firstly, as said here, I wanted to provide a resource that separates Arc 1 and Arc 2 performance of characters a little. Now, most resources, somewhat understandably, are focused on Arc 2 content, given that the hardest story chapters are stuck in Arc 2, as well as the D-Tide mode, which in Alert 4 and Alert 5 is most of the hardest side, of late game. However, when people start playing, you might have started playing recently, you might be coming back. You know, for the first 50 to 100 hours of play, depending on how fast you go, you're mostly going to be playing Arc 1. I mean, there is a lot of content in Arc 1. Nine full chapters, daily dives, you know, etc. And really, there isn't anything remotely close to a modern Arc 1 tier list. The last time there were tier lists focusing on Arc 1 was about January. So, this is for that. And to help with your decisions, as it says. And also, yeah, as it says here, possibly in 2 weeks, there's going to be a little bit of reworking to Chapter 8 and 9, mostly to the mechanic. And Phantasmal Dive is also going to change somewhat. Which means how much of a change this will be is not public knowledge. But it's going to be some magnitude of change. And, you know, who knows? A year or two later, the game hopefully will still be updating. I might still be playing. You might still be playing as well, if so, or maybe not. And in those cases, here's a list of this moment, so to speak. Okay, so the parameters. Characters will be rated based on their very early game performance, which is chapters 1 to the midpoint of chapter 7. But more specifically, it's like the end of chapter 4 to chapter 7, since there isn't, for the most part, there isn't really a single kind of somewhat challenging fight until the Astral Hellhound boss, the Hound of Tindalos boss at the end of chapter 4. And then, really, Miryam and Goliath in chapter 5 can cause an early roadblock for some people. And then also based on their late Arc 1 performance, which is the rest of chapter 7, 8, and 9, plus the hard mode stages. We'll get into this in a sec. And then the Phantasmal Dive performance, of course. And yeah, no Event Madness stage ratings anymore, because after Tawil's rerun event, I genuinely think it's highly unlikely they will have an Arc 1 Event Madness stage ever again. It's not impossible that they rerun the event that hasn't rerun before, like Tyzer's, but it's unlikely. Okay, so what are the parameters for very early game performance? Pardon me, I was smoking outside. Not cigarettes, I mean smoking some meats. Okay, so for standard ban of characters in the early game, I think it's fair to say you'll probably only have E3, or slightly less than E3 at that time, with the amount of standard pulls you get for your default banner. Limited characters, this was harder to define, but I went with E1 for this early period. Same with time-gated. You can get the time-gated characters E1 and E2, in the case of Ogier, etc., immediately, but that's it, nothing more. Then you have to start waiting months. So for people who are veterans, make sure to note characters' skills are not going to be leveled, right? You don't even unlock higher level skills until quite a few keeper levels deep, which could be a few weeks into your playing of the game, or in some cases months. And believe me, there are some characters who are noticeably very dreadful without skill rank ups, which I will get into later. Others are not so affected. They mostly just scale their damage. So team comps, just bare bones, but suitable, and limited covenants, only the early game covenants, if at all, really. I mean, you barely have covenants at this point in the game. Since it's very early, if a character is very difficult to play, I will mention it. Okay, for late Arc 1 parameters, now standard banner characters will be up to OE, but I'll slightly bring them down if mostly the OE is carrying them. There's only a few characters for which that's true, but I'll mention it. Limited characters are still at E3, quote-unquote, only. Of course, E3 is, for a lot of people, the final breakpoint or quite an impactful investment, but do bear in mind that if you have OE characters, especially OE damage dealers, it might not affect your rating on this. Time-gated characters, this is a problem. Time-gated characters for Aigis, Aurita, and Erica will be at E2. That's what you can get after basically a month from when you start playing, which I think is about fair to be at this time. An E3+1, same story with Ogier and Lotan. Characters will be assumed to have no more higher than level 5 skills, and more covenants will be permitted, but not the high level ones, which are Organic Form Paradox, Medicine, Dreams of Medicine, and Ring of Chamber 36. And yeah, I'll mention the infamous Fertility Orison abuse. Okay, Phantasmal Dive. I'm sorry for such a long parameters section, by the way, but with a tier list, it is very important to establish what I'm actually rating it on before I start going off and dropping some hot takes. Okay, so for P-Dive, 45,000 target score. That is about what that is the reliable Master of Dreams requirement, and I would consider that to be like a late or an end game score. You shouldn't really need to go higher than that unless you're showing off. Frankly, often you shouldn't need to go that high as it is, but I will rate it on 45,000 because frankly, when it comes to like 30,000, 36,000, you often don't really notice the difference between characters as long as they can put up a little bit of base damage on turn 1. So for Phantasmal Dive, I will look at their OEs more, and I'll also mention how good whale supports are for those characters. Okay, without further ado, I will come to the list I've already set up. So we've got our tiers. Game Breaking, which most of them don't need an introduction, but I will mention the Game Breaking tier is for the very few characters that I genuinely believe imbalance or remove a lot of the challenge of some of the most significant and difficult fights in Arc 1. Or have some other kind of extremely degenerate mechanic. Quote-unquote degenerate, let's say. Either great or terrible. This is for a few specific characters who, in certain situations or certain stages, such as perhaps the hard Chapter 9 final boss fight, are extremely good, but for general use, are quite or very bad. And then Struggling and D-Slimed are just your low tiers, with D-Slimed being the pretty hopeless tier, so to speak. Okay, so having a quick look at my runtime. Without further ado, we will start with the 24s, and we're off to a doozy with Ultra 24. I think it's fair to already put her in the either great or terrible tier. I don't think most people would disagree with this. Now, Ultra 24 for early game purposes. For early game purposes, she does have quite a good white stance, depressive stance exalt. But in general, she is not really at all an early game character. Namely because she scales by a huge percentage off counter. But the counter needs to be accrued by other teammates is the problem. Ultra 24 is basically a counter dumping character with massive damage and some ability to Aliemus sustain herself as is usual for 24. But without being fed counter by other teammates, she cannot really do anything. And the main issue is, I still put her here, but it must be said that when you go into late game as well, late arc 1, not late game. When you go to late arc 1, I assume, like I said, limited characters will be assumed E3, right? Really, for Ultra 24 to work at her full potential, she needs to have her over exalt for the big frenzied / nuke. And a lot of the characters she needs to support her are limited and will require at least E3. Usually the best support is Overexalt Daffodil, which again is only something you will see in Phantasmal Dive. But I don't want to denigrate this character because she has literally the highest damage output in the game. And you will see highlight reels of people doing 72,000 deep dives in 2 turns. Okay, so Caro 24, I would say, has quite a proficient early game. Even though you're fairly unlikely to pull her in said early game, we're still rating off her performance in those chapters. She has fairly high base damage in general, and Caro Chaos is a very strong realm combination for early game. With Gluttony, you can gain a large amount of max health per turn just by doing nothing, essentially, which usually exceeds the amount of the amount of shield you can set up. Additionally, the White Stance Exalt of Caro 24 has a very good scaling on the flat health early game. Like in the very early game, if you have her at level 60 and nothing else, it still gives you about 120 furnace healing, I believe, flat, which is a very strong amount in addition to the other effects it has. The downside is that Caro 24's performance, even by late Arc 1, kind of starts falling off. She has a bit of an underdeveloped kit in this realm. Her Manic Stance Exalt simply does not do enough damage, even while boosted. And the entire kit suffers from being a mix of support and damage in a way that is a bit incoherent. Accordingly, she's not unusable in Phantasmal Dive, but I personally have never seen her in high-scoring Phantasmal Dive. Her capabilities as a healer and an Aliemus support are both very outclassed by some other options. With that being said, she does feel... I'm going to put her at low C tier for now, and I will be ordering within tiers, of course, because I would hesitate to say that she struggles, but there's also a lack of cases where she is the best option. Okay, so Aequor 24, the most famous 24. But believe it or not, for most of the time after her release, this was a realm that no one played, is the funny thing. Aequor 24 has a... honestly, her early game does leave a bit to be desired. Mostly because in the very early game, you lack Aliemus generation quite badly. So make sure to use wheels like... Aged, the Wheat Wheel, and Tiny Wish, perhaps, to turbo out your exalts more. Because, of course, Aequor 24 is not very good at stimming her own Aliemus. She only has her own Aliemus generation, which is decent, but is definitely not up to a modern standard of Aliemus bloat. And she needs to be getting off her white and red exalts, preferably with crits, in order to put out the big damage. However, Her late Arc 1 performance is very solid overall. Once you have the correct types of supports for her, and she is quite versatile, she can use preferably like G-Doll, but you can use Corposant, Caecus. Frankly, most standard Aequor characters and limited Aequor characters work fine, as well as for a more budget option, well, Ramona's always good as well. Like, there's a lot of ways to make... Oh, Nautila is pretty decent. There's a lot of ways to make a kind of budget Aequor 24 team that is quite decent, but she does struggle somewhat with fragility. And another issue is just that if you miss the crit on her Red Stance Exalt, which even once you get to chapter 7 and 8 is a very real possibility without covenants like April Praise or enough Keyflare to power Crimson Pulse, if you miss that crit, it can kill you, is the issue. It really can kill you. And she also has a few bad matchups, like the chapter 7 based eyeball in chapter 9, because that is functionally poison immune, is an obvious problem. Overall, oh yeah, and her Phantasmal dive performance is, it's just decent. It's the same issue with damage bloat and survivability. But when she can stat check enemies, it's an easy win. Overall, I put her in A tier. Okay, so on to Chaos 24, who is the most kind of outdated, I suppose you'd say, and the most underappreciated easily of the 24 realms. Well, certainly the most unknown, probably. I do actually think she is quite underrated in Arc 1. Now, you have to recall, there was a time before G-Doll, before Tawil, before even Riker, when Chaos 24 was the only pure Chaos damage dealer functionally, apart from Lotan to a degree. And in that regard, how does she stack up? Well, I have actually played her during the early game, and she's honestly pretty good from a very early game perspective. Her White Stance Exalt giving a huge amount of flat Keyflare and her solid base damages can quite easily take you through a lot of the early chapters and stat check them. Now, her scaling into the later arc does struggle a lot more, although generally speaking, late Arc 1 more has issues of difficult enemy mechanics and somewhat trolly enemy mechanics in a lot of cases, rather than severe enemy HP blow. So she can still contribute, especially as a more of a sub DPS option for someone like Tawil or maybe Kathigu-Ra. Although I think part of the issue is it's a little hard to tier her because of how underplayed she is nowadays. Once Tawil got released, almost no one played her as a damage dealer again. I would not play her, admittedly, in a hard Phantasmal dive stage, just because the HP blow, even in 45k Phantasmal dive, tends to be much more significant than most of even hard Arc 1. With usually a boss with easier mechanics, but they have a total HP of about 700 or 800k usually. Accordingly, at least for now, I think it's fair to put her in the B tier overall. She's a solid option you could try out for yourself if you happen to pull her early game and see how she feels on a pure Chaos team. Going from one difficult to rank character to another difficult to rank character, since we've got Corposant. Now, Corposant is a modern character. What is significant about modern characters compared to older ones is not necessarily that they're stronger in general or as a whole, but they tend to have much higher amounts of base damage. The base damage and base shield quantities of characters from later year 2 are notably more bloated compared to that of earlier characters, who more so have to rely on multipliers and their kit mechanics to do lots and lots of damage, even if fundamentally they can do pretty similar damage in the end. Now, how would I rank Corposant? It's a little difficult to say, because firstly, just to reiterate, Dreams of Medicine and Paradox are both excluded covenants. Why is this an issue? Because they're Corposant's best in slot covenants. The best you can run, just checking I'm recording, the best you can run outside of that is Burial Grounds, really, to give a small amount of scaling with her passive. And that's really nowhere near as good. With that being said, she is a death resistance modern carry character. Why is being a death resistance character good? Well, in Arc 1, death resistance is really, really strong, especially when you have it on a damage dealer or support unit who isn't all in on it. That'll come up later. Being able to build death res and trigger more of Corposant's passive, because of course, with her E3, her Exalt gets stronger. Each time in the fight, she has triggered death resistance, which barely comes up in Arc 2 in most cases, but actually comes up a lot in Arc 1, because towards the late amount of Arc 1, especially with the Chapter 8 and 9 resonance, you can have 600% death res in a lot of cases. And let's not forget that Lightning Retribution just has a lot of damage and makes Tentacles attack, which Tentacles, again, are functionally based damage. So even with her being a little clunky, I would still say that she low diffs, so to speak, most of the early game. With that being said, her Phantasmal Dive performance is okay, but leaves some to be desired. As a whale support candidate, or just as a character for it in general, she sometimes has a bit of inconsistency in getting big shields up versus the very, very high damage output of high score Phantasmal Dive enemies. Ridiculously high, honestly. Overall, I would put her in high A tier, I think, because I wouldn't quite say she dominates Arc 1, but she's certainly a strong character. Now we come on to Lotan. This one breaks my heart, honestly. Now, Lotan has kind of been done dirty by the game, and also done dirty by the parameters of this tier list. Because, as I said, time-gated characters will be at E3+1. The reason for that is, I think it's fair to assume that you'll be hitting Chapter 8 and 9 after, say, a month of playing, for someone who's playing a decent amount, but not playing obsessively. And in those cases, you're not going to have Lotan's Exalt, and you're not going to really have over-Exalt, and you're not really going to have the tools for her to succeed. Now, granted, even with her over-Exalt, there's kind of a lack of extremely good enemies for it to match up against in Arc 1. Additionally, she is both the beneficiary and victim of having a powerful Soul Forge. Now, what does a powerful Soul Forge mean? A Soul Forge is a buff that's active, a specific buff that's active only in Arc 2. When a character has a powerful Soul Forge, that's generally bad news for their Arc 1 performance, and this will come up fairly often in the list, I'll tell you. Now, of course, Lotan can still work through the early game just fine, although really, given that she is very reliant on strength growth for her actual damage dealing, and doesn't provide the greatest amount of strength generation herself, particularly at low levels, even her early game performance does leave some to be desired. And I have to say, although she is playable, she is certainly not a very good character either for the end of Arc 1 with Chapters 8 and 9, or for Phantasmal Dive. And I'm not personally aware of a 72,000 Phantasmal Dive score that's been done with Lotan, although I might just not be aware of it, which, if true, is quite unfortunate. Now, Lotan is frankly much better in some specific stages and in Arc 2, but this is an Arc 1 tier list, and accordingly, I have to put her in the D-Slime tier, really, which pains me, but she just does not have any aspect that is particularly good. Oh, Genesis Doll. Okay, this one's a real doozy, honestly. So first off, just to remind the parameters of the tier list, no OE for this. If you have, I know a lot of people did happen to get OEG Doll in the past, but this one's not for you. With that being said, E3 G-Doll is still a pretty... E3 G-Doll is still pretty decent, a pretty solid general support, especially for a base damage scaling character like Aequor 24. But I think in general, her kit does leave a little bit to be desired. Her healing at lower levels, and without overexalt, her healing is solid. It's solid, but it's not really exceptional. Usually at level 60 alone, you usually be healing about maybe 70 with her free cost, which is okay durability, but does leave some to be desired. Her early game performance also leaves some to be desired, especially because, in my opinion, before she has Aurita, she doesn't even apply any poison, functionally. And her E3 also, without her E3, which yes, I do assume you would have by late Arc 1, without that E3 as well, her strikes and defense are just really bad as well. And in general, she has this very powerful exalt, but the character's held back. Now, her Phantasmal Dive performance is definitely a lot better, but she's not a dominating character in Phantasmal Dive either. As a whale support, she's a solid character to take as a whale support. She can easily clear boss fights, but you're still gonna need some kind of characters that can easily chop through the mobs and elites. Since functionally this is basically a character with only strong support options until you get to the boss, when she can really take over with her the end. With that being said, she also... It must be noted that she has the unique ability to cheese, well, almost unique ability to kind of cheese the hard and normal mode Chapter 9 final boss. And you can use her end of, I've forgotten the name of it, but you can use her zero cost card when she transitions into finale form. And that will basically skip a good chunk of the final fight, which is definitely significant because that fight is pretty hard and also just really frustrating. Overall, it's pretty hard to place her, but I'm gonna put her at the top of B tier for now. She is just a character that is very, very difficult to rate, situationally speaking, but overall a better character in Arc 2 than Arc 1. I think, despite the fact her poison is uncapped actually, but from a early to mid game perspective, the uncapped poison doesn't really matter so much because there's very few fights in the game you'll be getting these ridiculous several 100,000 poison procs on anyway. Caecus. Gods, I really gave myself a lot of the difficult characters to rank early. Okay, so Caecus, their early game is really solid. Most people do know that. Their early game is really solid with passive healing that is actually significant in the early game, and they can put up little amounts of counter and significant shields, which can usually deal with enemies, no sweat. But the late part of Arc 1, now it should be mentioned that they have a very, very good Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is pretty much their peak. There's a lot of enemies that multi-attack a great deal. And the Chapter 7 resonance mechanic pairs fantastically well with their Shattered Halberd, which allows them to basically function as a super carry for Chapter 7 and for the most part easily breeze through it as long as you have enough damage and shield to just back them up. Say like with Nautila or something, just for safety. But their performance in 8 and 9 is really... It's pretty lackluster, honestly, even by that point. In my view, it is lackluster. Now, it's certainly still playable. But there's a few fights like the Chapter 7 based eyeball that explicitly they counter-retaliate. And it's also not that great against they also don't have that great of a matchup against the Chapter 9 final boss either. And in Deep Dive, they used to be a much better character in the past. One thing that is nice in their favor is that their overexalt is really not relevant at all. It's one of the worst overexalts in the game. So you can basically just go to E3, level them up, and they're a good stat stick in that regard, which is usually how they are used as a very passive-aggressive kind of character. But yeah, you come onto Phantasmal Dive, and they are... Bluntly speaking, they're mostly outclassed by Corposant nowadays. There's no two ways about it. They are pretty much a solid character, a solid offensive support character that can be used to apply mass vulnerable to people and basically get the mobs ready to be taken out. The problem is Corposant also applies mass vulnerable with a bigger damage boost, and Phantasmal Dive enemies have far too much HP to tank. With that being said, there has been some gimmicky clears of Caecus carry 72k with very high healing, like with Leigh. So they can't completely be counted out in that regard either. But yes, they're very much a fan favorite for early game, and I do see them as a little bit overrated, but they still definitely get the job done, and their high performance through to about like the midpoint of Chapter 8. They have a couple decent fights in Chapter 8 too, like Ties is quite a playable fight for Caecus overall. With that all being said, I think I would put them very middle of the road in the B tier. Oh, Faros. Okay, Faros is, biasly speaking, Faros is one of my favorite characters from a design standpoint. But in terms of her rating, well, let me go more methodically if possible. So her early game, her early game honestly shouldn't have anything to complain about. I personally consider her early game to be very good, especially once you get her E3. Her strikes and defense, triggering additional tentacle hits, and the fact that you often run her with Twisted Twins Black, an early game Covenant, means that she can put out she can actually put out good, consistent damage and help clear mob encounters in an efficient manner in the early game. Her E3 is extremely good. It gives her 3 Aliemus per card left in hand at the end of turn, which you can also end turn and kill them with tentacles and still get the bonus of that. That can often give you 15 to up to 30 Aliemus per turn for doing nothing, essentially. Which means you then have her exalt to set up for combos on tough elites and bosses very, very, very easily. So great early game performance in my opinion. Unfortunately, the honeymoon period kind of ends about, I would still say in Chapter 7, being able to claim cards is still really useful. I mean, being able to search cards from your deck is never something that stops being useful. The problem is that other aspects of her kit start to fall off severely unless you base an entire team very much around her, which can work, but you can say that for like almost every character in the game in the end, and that requires investment. And the issue is that when you get deep into Chapter 8 and 9, apart from some issues with matchup dependency and her rouse dependency, she really requires her rouse to be activated for her to be a particularly good draw support. Sometimes she faced a lot of competition from other draw supports, usually characters that can do a little more, and it's just once her strike and tentacle follow-up damage output starts to fall off, which is really quite early in that late Chapter 7 purview, she does suffer a lot, relatively. For Phantasmal Dive, honestly, I think for 45,000, she's totally playable, but again, not exceptional. She's pretty much just a support for a carry that really needs their cards. And in fairness, her exalt is one of the best. Her exalt is, it's a very good exalt. It should not be counted out. I would deem towards her, I do think she's a bit underrated. I would put her on either low B tier or high C tier. I always found her more like low B tier, but I think for the average person and not using her in a team equipped for her, she probably goes in the top of C tier. Okay, Helot Catena. Oh boy. Yeah. What a famous and infamous character she is. So, by the gods, for Helot. So it should be mentioned, a lot of people, I actually asked people around for this, and a lot of people did want me to mention that Helot Catena can kind of have some issues with early game, especially without Enlightens. Now, her Hatred Unleashed can usually clear most encounters by itself since it has such high base damage, but she does self-harm a lot, a really drastic amount, honestly. And without kind of adapting your playstyle to account for that and stalling fights a little usually to use flails to get your lost HP back, you can run into some slight issues. Usually in about mid to late chapter 6 is when you might have an issue with that. Although I have to say, it'll probably be the last time you have an issue with it because her chapter 7 is incredibly broken with her ability to duplicate flails on lock, basically. With the Orison effect, it really, really gets out of hand. And yeah, her chapter 8 and 9, she is one of the best damage dealers, if not the best damage dealer in the game. Her almost unique ability to apply a ton of bleed damage can straight up cheese a lot of difficult encounters and even bypass phases of bosses. And again, in Phantasmal Dive, I think she needs no introduction. Whether she's being used by yourself or most likely as a whale support with a fat +12 Giant's Blade Helot Catena, she is definitely one of the best and most reliable Phantasmal Dive carries, with particularly good matchups against some bosses. Even accounting for some slight issues with her skill level ups and getting used to playing with her, it would be ridiculous not to put her in S tier. But I do not consider her to be game-breaking, or at least more game-breaking than other good damage dealers. Oh, coming on to Aigis. This is where it gets interesting. Now, in the very early game, Aigis is really, really, really solid. The ability to petrify encounters in case you brick, and also to petrify bosses, explicitly giving you an additional turn, is extremely powerful. Although in the very early game, with Exalts being a little less in supply, you could argue that a character like Feint might be slightly better for this purpose. But in general, Aigis has a really good kit, even accounting for the fact that her E3, which returns her Little Wish to hand every time you devour with a 0 cost, is an amazing Enlighten. Even accounting for the lack of Little Wish, she is really solid in early game, and once you get to late, Arc 1 is where she really becomes ridiculous. Now, in my view, Aigis is the #1 character that trivializes the eyeball encounters in Chapter 9, which is a roadblock for a lot of people. If you are having difficulty with those eyeballs, and you can at all afford to run Aigis without completely adapting your team, you should. If you put them into having lost a health bar and then petrify them, they will be petrified, lose all of their reinforce, and then still be stuck because it delays their rotation, still be stuck trying to reinforce themselves. This basically lets you skip 2 whole phases and makes none of them, even on hard mode, provide a particular difficulty. She can also skip phases in the Chapter 8 final boss, and even in Phantasmal Dive, she is really still one of the best. She's one of the best characters, especially if you are not confident in your team's ability to guaranteed kill turn 1 over and over. Since in Phantasmal Dive, usually, except with specific teams, not killing turn 1 means eating at least 1 death resistance. Overall, this is going to be quite controversial, but in Arc 1, I would say Aigis is actually game-breaking. The fact that she trivializes the eyeball bosses, I think makes her more notable even than Helot Catena, since Helot Catena, while incredibly strong, can still be replaced by another powerful DPS. Okay, so Nautila. Yeah, I love Nautila. I mean, who doesn't love Nautila? The only thing I don't love about her is that she's a Chaos Standard character, and pulling for her is a bit of a nightmare, isn't it? Nautila has a really good early game. In the early game, for very early chapters, even just her free cost gives enough temporary counter, usually for enemy encounters to instantly kill themselves, basically, when they attack you. Which makes her incredibly, powerful for those early chapters. By about chapter 7, that doesn't really work anymore, of course, but that's fine because you're generally playing her for her powerful one cost, and for her multiplicative exalt. Now, in the early game, a lot of shield options that can be powerful in Arc 2 or in the later game do not hold up as well. But Nautila always gives you shield and then 1.5 times it at the end, which can equate to hundreds of shield and get you to shield as much as your max HP. This is one of the only realistic ways to block a lot of sure kill attacks when you're at a low keeper level. So I consider this to be a very strong aspect of her. With that being said, beyond her exalt and her short-term memory, which is a really good card, she doesn't bring the most, and she also has issues in Phantasmal Dive, of course. For Phantasmal Dive specifically, you really wouldn't run her because if you're using a hyper defensive playstyle, you're probably using max HP scaling characters, which she is not. Phantasmal Dive just does so much damage that Nautila can't keep up. Overall, I give her an A tier, probably around the bottom of A tier, I would say. I mean, she is a really good character, but I would put her under Corposant. Karen is a little hard to place again. I think, to me, Karen's early game is abysmal. It is abysmal dog shit, really. In the early game, you only get her exalt occasionally due to low skill levels, and her exalt is basically just a very glorified mouse wisdom with a little more. She really does not bring enough to a team from an early game purview. In the early game, it helps for all of your characters to be able to pull their weight individually to some degree, even in terms of damage, because you lack draw power, you lack Aliemus generation. And Karen's cards are awful, outside of maybe debatably Toadstew for the weekend. With that being said, later in Arc 1, she becomes pretty good filler, especially with certain broken damage dealers, Tawil. But she is mostly very restricted to that function. You will only ever see her in late Arc 1 and Phantasmal Dive, accompanying Tawil pretty much. I mean, there's no secret. She is just there to accompany Tawil. And maybe in very rare cases as like Helot Catena filler. But other than with Tawil, she is always a character that is not best in slot. But in Arc 1, when there's no limit on cards being played, her ability to just let you spam more can't be put down too much. In terms of placement... Oh, can my computer work? That was weird. In terms of placement, if you're asking me, here's my list. I would put a C tier. I do not think she's that good of a character in Arc 1, but it's hard for me to, in all seriousness, put a character that is used in high score deep dives very, very often in a C tier slot. So I will... Now, you know what? Screw Karen. Honestly, try playing her in the very, very early game with like a poor damage dealer like Lotan, and you'll see why I put her in C tier. Pardon me. Okay, pardon me. Now, moving swiftly on to Hameln. Hameln is, honestly, in some ways, they like the better Karen. Now, something that is really nice about Hameln is that their E0 and their E0 performance is quite good, especially by... Hopefully I didn't pick up. Their E0 performance is quite good, especially by modern standards, when that is becoming less and less prevalent. And their E2 is also very strong, although it does have a few situations in which it actually makes it a little worse, quite infamously. With that being said, I think Hameln is they're quite poor in the early game. In the early game, they have a similar problem as Karen, but not nearly as bad as Karen. But it's the same issue of they are a very passive, supportive character. And without their skill levels and without good Aliemus generation, other than duplicating one card per stage in the boss fight, they really don't do that much. With that being said, when you get to late Arc 1, from a late Arc 1 perspective, they are one of the most broken characters in the game. I don't consider them to be one of the absolute best, because there are some that are even better. But the Fertility Orison, or indeed, well, either the Chapter 7, 8, or 9 version of Fertility Orison with Memory Rondo can easily create absolutely gargantuan amounts of permanent strength and Arithmetica and draw power. With no real downside, other than that you're not using it on someone else. So yeah, I don't think it needs too much introduction unless you're watching this being brand new to the game, in which case, hi. But yeah, having Hameln certainly makes Chapter 8 and 9 noticeably easier, although also noticeably more sanity damaging to play, because you will be there for like 1 hour on the difficult stages just to get through it. I promise you that for free. Phantasmal Dive is... They are a perfectly serviceable, good character in Phantasmal Dive. You'll see them be used with pure Caro teams, almost always, pure Ultra teams, and pure Chaos teams. Especially the pure Chaos teams with Tawil. It says a lot that in Arc 2, they implicitly and explicitly got nerfed quite a lot, and it was targeted. Apart from, although they have some awkwardness and rockiness in some aspects of their career, if you just can't fund their Aliemus, overall, it would be crazy not to put them in S tier, given their obscene strengths. Okay, now we come on to Tawil. Oh, what can I say about Tawil that hasn't been said before? Especially given that I am not going to do a 24 and place her in 4 different realms, even though you could argue doing so would be more accurate. Tawil is... Well, first things first, Tawil's E0 performance is actually god's awful, so do not pull her at E0 and expect to have a good time. Her E1 is the bare minimum for her to function properly. Her E1 makes her kit actually good, which was a bit of a practical joke from the developers, given that they handed out E0 Tawil for free at the first anniversary. But she is on banner at the time of recording this video, and you can get it to E1. Now, my issues with Tawil are, as long as you have her E1, she can... This is funny. She actually can run into some small problems in the very early game, especially... Now, I did mention, if you'll recall, that characters will be penalized slightly for being difficult to play, in my subjective opinion at least. Now, Tawil is not necessarily difficult to play. However, when you're brand new to the game, you have no idea what her copied cards do. You use her Exalt and see a bunch of cards you've never seen before in your entire life. So her Exalt is really not the easiest to use, and in the early game, she also lacks a lot of the flat key flare to fund her kit. With that being said, with the very early game being very much on the easier side and her having strength down built into her kit, I hesitate to say she is poor in it. I'm just mentioning that she is not an absolutely free face roll compared to a few other characters who just play 2 cards and the encounter's over. But yes, with that being said, her late Arc 1 performance is incredibly good. Late Arc 1 was essentially built for her, built for her own. She is what you would call a Nepo baby character. They released her. She was, at the time she was released, by far the strongest. Well, okay, she was the strongest character in the game. I would say stronger than Helot Catena, but that's technically debatable. In any case, Chapter 9's mechanics were basically designed for her and Helot Catena, and they were not so good for most of the other characters at the time. So obviously her late Arc 1 performance is very good. And on to Phantasmal Dive as well. Yeah, I mean, Chaos Tawil is an incredibly reliable way to clear 72 high score Phantasmal Dives. People do it all the time. It's not so reliable in terms of your sanity, and there is some RNG involved, but certainly she is a great whale support to borrow, and learning how to play her, at least on a basic level, can reduce a lot of frustration in Arc 1 content. I am going to put her at the top of S tier, which is probably a little controversial in itself, but same logic with Helot Catena. An amazing damage dealer, but she doesn't do anything which is irreplaceable, right? Kathigu-Ra, okay, I'm gonna firstly freely admit that compared to like almost any character on the T list, this is the character I have the least Arc 1 experience with. I've only really gotten to play her in Arc 2 mostly. I did briefly speak to a couple Kathigu-Ra players just to confirm things about this. As a modern character, Kathigu-Ra has an extremely easy early game. Kathigu-Ra's Solar Flare and Last Stand Salvo should basically one-shot encounters until about chapter 5 or 6. And even for the harder fights, you can just stack a Solar Flare or a brief Hyper Flare. Although, I should say, I did say that early game would include E1 only, and her pre-E3 performance is quite awful. She is another Morrowman's classic of a character that doesn't even have the bones of their kit until E3. Since her E3 provides the absolute full amount of her scaling. She does benefit from skill levels too, and from character levels. So these are slight penalizations against her. In late Arc 1, in terms of the story mode, she has no especially broken synergies, but she is just a really powerful character in general, and also the fact that the Chapter 7 final boss, Chapter 8 final boss, and Chapter 9 final boss are all encounters which are basically forced to go longer. Accordingly, any encounter that is forced to go long is very much to her benefit, because she scales pretty much for existing. Her base damage just keeps going up as she creates and consumes Fiamma stacks. She doesn't have anything especially degenerate like for this arc, like max HP scalings, but again, after a few turns, she should be one-shotting the final phases, given that she's had the free scaling. Overall, I don't feel too confident about this. Oh, right. Yes, Phantasmal Dive. I almost forgot. So this is where I actually am penalizing her, because I've seen it written and been told on fairly good authority that Kathigu-Ra, compared to a lot of whale characters, is not really the best or most reliable for high score D-Tide farming. It's still, deep dive farming, Phantasmal Dive. It's certainly something she can do, but not something she excels at. I think this combination of factors puts her in a high A tier. Celeste. I love Celeste. Okay, Celeste is quite a simple character, really. She has a very good early game performance, because early game she provides Arithmetica and a better pseudo death res. two things that you're usually in very short supply of in the early game. She also really does not need much in the way of skill levels or card levels. They do benefit her healing numbers, but it's mostly what her kit does, which is much more important than the actual numbers of her heals and the like. However, she is a bit of a dead character on the other side, as in she really is just there for her Exalt and for her zero cost. Although Eternal Phantom is a surprisingly decent skill if you do have a tentacle scaling team. And it does retain, so that's nice as well. In terms of late Arc 1, she is, again, there's not much to say except she's solid. In late Arc 1, if you need a slot on your team to not do much but provide something useful with that slot on an Aequor team, then she is a good choice. If you need someone to handle multiple roles at once, then she really is not so good, because her only roles are really providing a little Arithmetica, a little weakness, and the pseudo death resistance, which is not as good as Feint's death resistance, but is still very potent in itself. Phantasmal Dive, she has high usage in Caro Aequor. There's not much to say, because in Caro Aequor, she basically, it's a fairly solid and easy way to get a 45k score, although not as good in my opinion as some other options, is just to play a Caro team, usually with Helot, Catena, and then Celeste is there too, to keep you going. Overall, I think she's fair to put in. I would put her in a B tier placement. I'm pretty happy with that. Really, it's your decision when you do and don't put her on the team. Erica, this is another one that pains me. She is a time-gated character, as mentioned, and the time gating really adversely affects her, because in the early game, if she had access to her E3, her X cost card could basically solo most encounters with no effort at all. But early game, you're not going to have the E3 because it takes at least 2 months of gameplay to get it to E3. And that's with doing Phantasmal Dives as well. Accordingly, the thing is, Erica is a decent character. Her kit is quite decent, but she really suffers from having outdated numbers. Her base numbers are very poor. Like, for example, her function overload, even at level 6, I believe is 30% attack scaling per hit, even though it is 2 hits, which is really low compared to a lot of the modding characters, which easily crack like 70, 80, even 100% attack per hit. She is basically, in Arc 1, she is mostly relegated to being a filler character, but she does provide decent shielding, solid key flare, and vulnerable and weaken application, albeit she's not going to provide 100% uptime on it, but her Exalt does provide both of them. But those the time-gated enlightens and the lack of base numbers, they negatively impact her early game, and really in late Arc 1, in late Arc 1, she still doesn't have her E3, at least as I'm considering this list. And she is certainly viable. You can absolutely run her, but is she better than options, even non-limited options? Like, is she going to be a stronger asset to the team than Winkle, or even Tinct, honestly, especially given Tinct's buffs? It's very unlikely. So I think our first struggling placement is a good placement. Oh, Clementine, the famous Clementine. I love this character, but Clementine is indisputably an Arc 2 based character. She was released during Arc 2's era, and she is designed for Arc 2's era. She, much like Tawil, she scales, not exponentially, but she scales to a high degree off having a ton of key flare. Having more flat key flare not only gives her much more key flare generation, but also gives her more damage because it just affects her crit rate. But her key flare basically decides her crit rate, right? Is one of her mechanics. With that being said, given that Clementine has modern numbers, even though she is definitively a support, given that she has modern numbers, her Exalt easily clears out elites and puts a big dent in bosses for most of the early game. Don't expect this to continue being the case because her Exalt is basically a chunky amount of flat damage. It doesn't really scale with anything in particular. It's just the flat damage. But if you can get it to crit, that's very nice, of course. Her late Arc 1 performance is really, like, again, she's often considered to be disappointing in Arc 1, sorry. But that's not because she's actually bad in Arc 1, it's because her Arc 2 performance is incredibly good. In Arc 2, where key flare requirements are so much higher, the massive amount of key flare she generates is much more useful. And she also has more abilities to deal with instant kill attacks from bosses, which are more valuable when you cannot use Death Res as easily on most team comps. So for Arc 1, looking at her, it's just solid all across, like solid in late Arc 1, solid in Phantasmal Dive. She is still used on high-scoring Phantasmal Dive teams quite often. Her 45% final damage multiplier is incredibly good. It would be criminal to put this character lower than, I would probably say about the middle of A tier for Arc 1. Whew. Hope everyone's taking care. Okay, for Castor. Now, Castor is, like I said, okay, starting chronologically, Castor's early game is really good. Their Onyx Plume and Corrosion will trivialize his encounters until definitely Chapter 6. You're not even going to have a worry. And they also put up a significant amount of shield with modern shield numbers compared to a lot of characters in that era. In terms of their late Arc 1 performance, they have good synergies. Well, Ultra is strong in late Arc 1 in general, and they have good synergies with the chapter mechanics. There is also the factor that their corrosion mechanic is straight up pretty broken in Arc 1. You see, when Arc 1 bosses change forms and go into immunity while they're changing forms, they can still be damaged normally at full efficiency. It just doesn't count towards damage done to them. But here's the thing. Castor's corrosion is HP loss. It inflicts, as long as there's corrosion to hit, it inflicts HP loss times 3 the damage you did. So basically, if there's a bunch of corrosion left on them after they've gone into immunity and you still have the ability to attack them with other members of the team, you can just hit them for like half or sometimes even all of their health before the second phase even truly begins. Very similarly to Bleed, except debatably even better, depending. Now, I didn't consider Castor's Overexalt here. Their Overexalt is truly broken in Arc 1. Their OE is, if you included their OE, they would be ludicrous and definitely go in the game-breaking tier. But other than whale supports and Phantasmal Dive, I'm not really considering that. Although they are one of the best whale supports in Phantasmal Dive, incidentally. With this all being said, even the E3 Castor has got to go in S tier. Where they go in S tier is a bit difficult to decide, actually. I mean, they are just so... I would probably put them above Catena just because I haven't heard anyone complain about difficulty using Castor. It's really hard to go wrong with this guy. Winkle. Oh boy. Okay, Winkle is actually quite bad early game. Like, a lot of people recommend picking her up off the initial 5 summon. Which can be good if you don't want to pull an Ultra and you just want to have her around for later. But I really would say that her early game performance is not, it does leave quite a bit to be desired, in my opinion. But her late Arc 1 performance, her late Arc 1 performance and her Phantasmal Dive performance is extremely good. The ability to exalt twice in a turn with her E3 is a completely unique utility that only she has. And in Arc 1, where you can generate ridiculous amounts of Aliemus on certain characters, it can be realistically utilized or debatably abused. in order to rack up ridiculous combos or amounts of damage. With that being said, it's a little hard to place her because she does also get harmed by the end effect, which is in effect in chapter 8 and chapter 9 boss stages, which punishes you quite significantly for spamming exalts, and they also cannot usually be bursted. But yeah, this completely unique utility and her powerful application in Phantasmal Dive, I would put her I'm confident putting her there. I like that placement. Aurita. Oh, this one upsets me. Okay, so Aurita is a solid character when enough time has passed and you have a lot of her enlightens. But the thing is, that really only applies to Arc 2. Shortly after Arc 2 started, Aurita was given really significant buffs, but some of the most significant buffs only apply to her Soul Forge. Her Dimension Image is also very, very, very good. All of these things combined mean that she has an early game, which her early game is horrendous. There's no two ways about it. She has very bad Aliemus generation since it's reliant on leveling up her Glen Split mostly. She even lacks some of her supports, like Kaeya can't be used in Arc 1 with her, since her Aftershock effect is also a Soul Forge, for example. Really, just everything conspires to make Aurita bad in Arc 1. There is exactly one person I can think of who regularly does 45,000 scores in Phantasmal Dive with Aurita. They're a really good player. And even then, with a good account, they still sometimes kind of struggle to get the clear. It really pains me, but especially given that I'm assuming that with the time gating, she won't have all of her enlightens. Her E2 is particularly impactful, although you will probably get that by the time you get to like the end of Arc 1, unless you're playing like crazy. With those things being said, she's really in a bad situation. The only good news I can say is that you don't especially have to invest her, and she becomes a lot more viable if you like her in Arc 2. But for Arc 1, it's a D-slimed. Tulu is... A lot of these middling characters are super, super, super hard to place, I find, and I think most people would agree with me on that count. So, Firstly, Tulu's early game is undeniably strong. Abyss Order can just clear any encounter until Chapter 8. But once Chapter 8 kicks in, much more severe issues start happening because you can no longer rely on the base damage of tentacles. Now, how does Tulu actually work? Tulu is an exponential scaling character. Tentacles in general, an exponential scaling mechanic. With, say, Tulu and Corposant, and with Tulu, Corposant, and Murphy, and characters like this together, they can create more tentacles, which deal more base damage, which also have their percentage damage increase and their crit damage, blah, blah, blah. You see how this is how tentacles can simultaneously fail to do more than like 1,000 and can also put out like 2 million damage at the end game in Arc 2. But generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that late Arc 1 is not the most favorable to Tulu, although they do have good potential against a couple difficult bosses like Aisha with her powerful reinforce, which Tulu can kind of bypass and do a lot of damage off on the crackback. But overall, it just becomes really difficult to place them. But I did specify that OEs won't be considered, because Tulu's OE, especially for a character of their age, is extraordinarily good. That OE can provide absolutely obscene amounts of damage as a sub DPS, but they don't have access to that over exalt in most of the categories I had, other than Phantasmal Dive. Therefore, I mean, Tulu is a really good character to invest, but they do struggle in Phantasmal Dive. again, mostly because of just the relative lack of damage in early mob encounters without being massively scaled up. And the fact that it is more difficult to tank hits in Arc 1 than Arc 2, because in Arc 2 your shields do noticeably more shielding. Overall, I just find it really difficult to place them. I could either put them in either great or terrible, since they do have an extraordinarily good early game. And if you do pull them early in the game, you should definitely slap them on your team, because they'll just carry you through for a little while. But I don't want to cop out with this tier unless it's truly required, so I think it's fair to put them... Nah, this placement just doesn't look right. They go in either great or terrible. There's no other way to describe them. Like, if you use them on a team properly for them, or it's early game, they're great. Otherwise, they are a pretty abysmal pick. Murphy. Oh, I love Murphy. Okay, so Murphy has lots and lots of applications, actually. I do think early game, if you don't use her properly, she can get you in trouble. Make sure not to get your sacrifice too high, or shield, or use her exalt in a very kind of willy-nilly fashion. Her exalt should be used when it's necessary, of course. But her ability to cut enemies' attack in half straight up, even with a very significant downside, is a very powerful ability. To top it off, she has a pretty damn good late Arc 1, in my opinion. Some people have even used Murphy with Fertility Orison on her 0 cost to accrue massive amounts of tentacle damage, which can get you through most encounters easily. Just be careful on the final boss of Chapter 8, because that fight is long and it clogs your deck a lot when you use Murphy in this way. But generally speaking, she is a really solid character. The only issue with her really is that she's not unusable in Phantasmal Dive, but once again, Phantasmal Dive has incredibly high damage. And Murphy can help you. Well, Murphy will let you tank it, but then you have like 600 sacrifice applied on yourself, which is not really where you want to be, and kind of is where the Murphy is on the side of the enemy kind of meme comes from. Overall, even hopefully you would have a significant amount of her enlightens, because E1 does make her playstyle much more stable, which, oh, she does apply vulnerable and weaken as well. It's a strong kit overall. I would put her, I'm not sure if I'd put her at the top of B tier or the bottom of A tier. I think the bottom of A tier, really, unless you put her a little lower if you really don't enjoy managing the sacrifice mechanic. Okay, now we come on to... Maybe I should have sped this up a bit. But, now we come on to Miryam. And, Miryam is... Okay, I mentioned at the start of the video how certain characters have incredibly poor synergies with... they get incredibly damaged by skill levels. And truthfully, when I thought of this, and when I thought of this as a category... Miryam was on my mind. Most of Miryam's skills and her exalt is quite bad without having a high skill level on it. Early game, she is almost a brick character because she provides so little damage, and her rouse is so slow and arithmetica heavy, and you can't survive for long enough for her rouse to be meaningful. And her exalt is also not very good without it being ranked up. She is truly, like, not only is she not a good limited character early game, she is even worse than most standard characters early game easily. And unlike a lot of characters, I would say in late Arc 1, she gets much better, but I would still say that it's certainly not an amazing performance. It's just an adequate performance mostly. And I have used Miryam quite a bit in late Arc 1, especially back in the day. Maybe she just didn't fit my playstyle, but especially of a low keeper level and therefore low HP, I always found her rouse quite annoying to use in boss fights. By the time her End of Faith final rouse is triggered, most of the fight should be over, or you might be dead, is a problem. And it's the same in Phantasmal Dive. That issue is also represented. She can be used in Phantasmal Dives at high scores, but only with very good investment, like a whale level of investment, pretty much. And her that extends to her overexalt being very, very, very good. It's a very strong overexalt, which really does everything she needs for her kit. And without that overexalt, she kind of has a partial kit, in my opinion. I genuinely think she is quite a poor choice in Arc 1, especially if you're accounting for all aspects of Arc 1 equally. I would actually put her all the way down here. I would run Faros any day over Miryam in early Arc 1, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, Faros' 2 cost even does more damage. Then we come on to Feint. This is quite a controversial character, actually. So firstly, Feint has one of the de facto best early games, because early game, you won't have high def res, and you also won't have high health. So Feint easily handles it. She is pretty much the best defensive character. Her shielding and strength down is also pretty useful early game, since relatively speaking it's quite high. But later in Arc 1, she becomes a lot more of a passive character. She does less of use, and in late Arc 1 specifically, you're given tons of def resistance by the mechanics, so it might be more beneficial to run and especially with many bosses having powerful multi-hits, you will need to run some kind of defensive character or healing on most team comps, as opposed to just def res checking it out, which usually extends to Phantasmal Dive too, except in some very specific cases. But with that being said, she is still a really good character, and I'm not. It's less a case of her defensive mechanic being bad. It's just that it's not as good in Arc 2. They dealt her a crappy hand in late Arc 1 relative to Arc 2. But she is still a really good character who can give you more survivability than almost any other character in almost all fights, unless they are fights with incredibly strong multi-hit attacks. Which there are a few that come to mind, like a lot of the eyeballs have strong times free attacks, for example. Overall, I would put her... It's a little hard to place her, but this feels like a fair placement. Okay, so for Thais. Now, it must be said that her early game performance could be better. Before you level her skills up, her Exalt is actually... You don't even want to Devour with her Exalt. Her Devour Exalt is basically detrimental, unless you use her Scions. But that's only early game, and even early game she is incredibly good overall. Yeah, there's no two ways about it that Thais is ridiculous. The only question with this character is whether she goes in game breaking or the top of S tier, which is really a matter of conjecture. She is an extraordinarily powerful Caro character who does almost anything. She gives your main damage dealer or main utility more of their best cards for nothing. She also creates Scions, which are a completely unreplicable mechanic, which enables a lot of the Caro characters to do some quite ridiculous things, which they simply cannot otherwise. And then also she also provides tons of Aliemus. In Arc 1, really tons of Aliemus because it's not nerfed. And also she provides Key Flare and Vulnerable and Weaken in a pinch, although it's not her primary purpose. I would definitely put her above Tawil. I think I would put her in the bottom. I mean, she is probably the most used character in Arc 1, give or take someone who's about to come up. So I will put her in the bottom of game breaking personally. I would put her a little bit behind Aigis just because of that. That Eyes utility is just completely extraordinary. And then we come on to, okay, it's funny that Horla happens to be after her. Really funny. Yeah, Horla is in my view the strongest character in Arc 1. Above even that of Tawil, above Catena, certainly above Castor without their overexalt. They are a ludicrously powerful character, and Arc 2 was half created just to keep her in line, just to send her back to jail in Paris, basically. Now, her early game does drag a little bit, but even in... Okay, yeah, in early game, with an E1, she doesn't provide the most, admittedly. So I suppose that is the one point against her, because her Carol Psalm, while a decent card, could be better when it's not skilled up. But her Exalt and the like are not dependent on skill level ups at all, which is an important benefit. And her... In Chapter 7 and 8, yeah, in Chapter 8 and 9, she enables a frankly ludicrous amount of ridiculous strategies, which can turn relatively difficult fights into complete jokes. She is also a good candidate for Fertility Orison if you don't have anyone better, like say Hameln. Since she can, you can also Fertility Orison her Carol Psalm, which is a very strong card to have, you know, a full handoff for free. It just gives about 15 Aliemus with each use. And in Phantasmal Dive, she is still a ludicrously strong character. Her Joy stance allows you to, basically allows you to double overexalt easily with Winkle. Granted, I said I wouldn't consider too many synergies, but it allows you to exalt on everyone every turn. It allows you to overexalt without worrying about it. It allows you to double overexalt. And then, even then, her defensive stance, the Sorrow stance, has incredible usage with Salvador, and her Wrath stance is one of the best. It's pretty much the best damage multiplier, since it gives a huge amount of crit rate and crit damage, which is also really useful early game when you lack crit rate, and gives you big final damage. There's no way to put this character but game breaking in Arc 1. Arc 2 knocks her down a bit, but she's still very good, especially because she has a strong Soul Forge. Now, maybe that is my bias, but after you've seen so many Billy videos or clips of people using prototype battery Horla or countless other nonsensical things, or Curran with Horla to just Curran wheel, with Horla to just heal for 1,000 a turn, you start thinking, man, I can see why they put her on lock in Arc 2. Okay, moving on now to Ramona. I think Ramona is quite an interesting character to rank as well. So, Ramona is a character that you definitively are most likely going to use in early game. Almost irregardless of whether you want to or not. She's the mascot character, the starting character, and provides just incredibly useful utilities for almost every damage dealer. There are more damage dealers who don't benefit. There are far more damage dealers that benefit from Ramona than those that do not. With that being said, in general, and especially in the early game, she does incredibly negligible damage. Fortunately, unlike the time-gated characters, you can get her constellations, especially at E3, quite a little bit faster than them, just through the keeper levels. Especially if you do burn a bit of your early Menafin, which is not, it's a pretty good idea, frankly, all things considered. Now, early game, she is pretty much a combo bot for your main damage dealer, but that's perfectly fine, because the early game is more about having reliability of effective combos, as opposed to having the strongest combo or the highest damage per turn possible. When you get into later Arc 1, however, she is still perfectly usable, but the the relative lack of contribution she has, especially without a ton of flat key flare, which tends to come a bit later in the game than like chapter 7, 8, and 9. The relative lack of contribution she has can hurt a little bit. But she is still a very good character for damage dealers that rely on 3 or 4 cost cards or specific combo pieces. Just as long as you don't particularly object to the fact that her 2 and 3 cost really do very little, besides generating key flare at times. That is their purpose after all. In Phantasmal Dive, she again fulfills the role of being used as filler, and is honestly a really solid character for a pure chaos team if you're not going for a ridiculous 72,000 or something, but rather the more reasonable 45k or so. Overall, I would put her... I feel like this is a good placement for her. In Arc 1, she feels very middle of the road. Because she is... I mean, as expected, she is one of the most generic support characters in the game, which means she's only rarely a best-in-slot character, but is almost always a good choice. Ogier. Ogier is also quite a generic support, but suffers relatively more. Now, it is nice that they have a frankly pretty good vulnerable card, although they can't be relied on to contribute 100% uptime vulnerability, like some characters like Aequor 24 and Aigis can, who functionally will always provide vulnerability as long as you have them on their team. But Ogier's vulnerability card is nonetheless good, and they also have a mostly useful X cost, which is pretty much, in most cases, is just a free card, which gives you a little bit of Aliemus and shield. The problem is, though, firstly, they're slightly time-gated in character in terms of their enlightens, and secondly, they have quite a good Soulforge, so there's an element of Soulforge syndrome again, but mostly I just tend to find that Ogier's team contribution, especially in like late Arc 1 on most teams with a low keeper level, their team contribution just leaves a lot to be desired. Frankly, their shields are just quite small compared to a lot of the modern standard shielding characters, especially compared to characters with extremely you could debate overstated shield numbers like Castor and Corposant. But even compared to characters like Nautila, Murphy, and even Clementine, and maybe even Alva, they have just unfortunately, very small shield requirements. Very small shield production. Unless you are against a boss that hits you with, apologies if I'm wrong on this, I believe Fragile. When they dispel Fragile, they create a huge shield. But there's only a few bosses in the game, in Arc 1 I should say. Most notably the dueling commander in mid-chapter 8, who has a significant fragile. Overall, I think putting them in struggling is a fair choice, and I personally like them less than Erica. I like that Erica provides both vulnerable and weak, at least. Sorry, Ogier. Doll is actually another really similar case. I should have split them up a bit. I really love Doll. Okay, Doll is a definitive Soulforge syndrome victim. Her Soulforge is actually pretty amazing. In late game, and here's the other thing, with max skills, something that you don't have for quite a while after playing, with max skills and her Soulforge, she can become a really good Aliemus battery that also heals and shields for pretty impressive numbers. But in Arc 1, none of those things are true, unfortunately. In Arc 1, her Exalt is a very weak Aliemus generating Exalt. It's basically going to generate less Aliemus than a 24-2 cost. Or even like, obviously much less than G-Dolls. but she just does not provide good AoE Aliemus with low skill levels on her Exalt, and she has bad stats which undermines your HP, and her healing, even on equivalent exchange or quid pro quo, her free cost, which can provide really nuclear amounts of healing and shield in Arc 2, in Arc 1, and especially in late Arc 1 with pretty understated characters, as is generally the case, it just does not put up enough durability to justify its use. But she still does provide vulnerability cleansing, which is very powerful because there are some difficult fights which incorporate vulnerability into that kit, and she does provide weaken as well. Overall, I would not put her in, it would either be in the top of D-Slimed or the bottom of Struggling, but I'm gonna show some mercy and put her in the bottom of Struggling. Okay, then we go on to Leigh. Leigh is, okay, here's not so much of a secret. This tier was created because I thought of Leigh, essentially. So, yeah, in the... Apologies. In the early game, Leigh is a ludicrously bad character, which is really where her bad reputation comes from. In the early game, she has very low stats, and you have very low total HP. And the thing is, Leigh's healing is not based predominantly on her own stats, but is rather based on the team's max HP. She can heal, with a Tie Scion, she can heal 32% of the team's missing HP, which can be a huge amount in certain situations. But without ties and in Arc 1 and in early Arc 1, it is healing a very very, very poor amount. Additionally, she benefits from having a very powerful Overexalt, which generates a lot of strength and also gives permanent crit rate and crit damage for the team, which can be really powerful in forced overly long fights. But again, until late chapter 8, apart from the chapter 7 final boss and chapter 6, I suppose, basically every fight is a combo based kill or be killed, in my opinion, which does not suit Leigh at all. She is truly abysmal in these cases. But in specifically the end of chapter 9 boss fight, she is a very good character, even if not very invested, because her heals are just... In the chapter 9 final boss fight, you can quite easily stack up 3k or more health, which makes her heals, even without ties, we'll discount ties here, her Devour heals can heal for like 500 total, which is really, really big. It's essentially better than most any other defensive character in the game. But other than chapter 9 final boss fight and Phantasmal Dive, where when invested, like with a lot of Enlightens, she can situationally be extremely strong in that she's one of the few characters that has a hope to tank the ridiculous damage output of Phantasmal Dive at high scores. But yes, I think I've waffled long enough, but she is de facto in the either great or terrible tier. Tinct. This is an interesting one because Tinct got a minor rework very, very recently. And this actually affects her quite a bit because her minor rework has increased her early game potency quite significantly. In the past, I would have said that Tinct is a poor character early game. And really that she requires a bit of knowledge to use too, since one of her most powerful mechanics is to center on stacking up Ultra Term with her Distant Melody card to have insane nuclear crit rate and crit damage. But frankly, in modern times, as long as you remember to use her leap cards when possible, going to the boss fight, you don't have to jump through too many hoops to make her good. Additionally, now her strikes actually provide solid damage early game. It is just early game, unless you go all in on focusing on her. But I do find supports that have useful strikes and defends to be a positive trait in early Arc 1. Since bricking on bad cards is one of the few things that can get you killed. And she, with there being no card limit in Arc 1, unlike the soft cap in Arc 2, her Exalt is actually really, really good. Her Exalt, in most cases, just outclasses Karen's, since it usually gives you like 4 or 5 Arithmetica of savings. They may not be as impactful as getting to use it exactly where you want, but it's still a very strong mechanic, especially of certain supports. And again, given that she now has a pretty decent shield from her defend as well, and provides team crit rate in high measures, which is I wouldn't say all important, but is definitely very beneficial early in the game. This makes her, in my view, a pretty underrated support overall. She also has solid usage in Phantasmal Dive, mostly to support characters like Salvador in high score runs, characters which really excel in tanking and building up their damage slowly, but need some help to do high burst damage. Overall, she's a little hard to exactly place, but I think if you use her properly, this is a placement I feel fairly good about. Yeah, I feel pretty good about this placement. I find her nowadays, if you're in a stage where her cleanse can be especially useful, you can bump her up a tier for that stage. But in general, on average, I'd say she's about a B tier. Jenkin. Okay, the famous best standard DPS TM. No, she is the best standard DPS. She is also very easy to play, and she essentially low diffs TM early Arc 1. Yeah, her early game is not just great for a standard, it's one of the best in game in general, because her AoE kills most encounters by itself, and her Exalt deletes most elites, with you needing to only put in a bit of effort to kill the harder bosses. Getting into Chapter 7, 8, and 9, Chapter 9 can provide some more significant problems, but it really depends on what supports you can provide for her. But her late Arc 1 is not as much of a dominating performance, but still, she still has, I mean, as long as you can put her with one of the quote-unquote busted supports like Hameln, Horla, etc., you shouldn't really have any issues. The only time you'll have big issues in Arc 1, in Arc 1 story, even the hard modes, is if you have to purely use standard supports for her, in which case she is still more than playable, just might not have the durability and quick burst damage to get through a couple encounters. If nothing else, you have Aigis for a dreadful Caro Ultra team. And then as for her Phantasmal Dive, yeah, Phantasmal Dive, the only problem is to really do the best damage possible. So Jenkin has very reliable damage, but it's not necessarily very high damage. Until you have her Soul Forge. Her Soul Forge is incredibly good, her Dimension Image is even better. These two things combined can let her do 1,000,000 damage in a burst, but in Arc 1 you don't have those things. Luckily, you don't normally need them, except in Phantasmal Dive, when sometimes you might need them, so certainly not as great of a Phantasmal Dive character. Overall, still impressive. I think putting her right here in high A tier is a good choice. Pandia. Yeah, okay, Pandia. Frankly, despite being the offensive temporary retaliate character, she doesn't even have as strong of an early game offensively as Nautila, who is essentially her defensive counterpart. So that is rough. Her early game is frankly playable, but apart from her 2 cost being quite a good card, Her free cost is really abysmal overall. It is very outdated in terms, it is very, very outdated in terms of numbers, and it didn't get any buffing either with her very mini rework that she got about a month and a half ago, I believe. As for her Exalt kind of struggles in tough non-boss fights. In boss fights, however, it can be a really good offensive counter dump, but much like with Ultra 24, you need someone else to generate the counter for her, which, as said before, are usually characters that are limited or in fairly short supply. With that being said, her Exalt can hit for insane damage in Arc 1, because it has full retaliate scaling and benefits from her crit rate and crit damage, and her crit damage is usually fairly high, but this is essentially her only saving grace. With that being said, I would be remiss to put her in the D-Slime tier, because even if they're mostly doing it to make a point and for preference, there are plenty of people with nice wanders or nice daffodils mostly that have used her in fairly hard content as a sub DPS, and she can also remove retaliate permanently off enemies, which admittedly is, although it's only useful in about 2 fights in the whole game, those fights are some of the more difficult in Arc 1, so it's overall overall worth noting. So she gets surprisingly, in my view, she makes it to the bottom of struggling tier rather than the D-Slime tier, because she does have those occasional points where she's better to be used. Alva, on the other hand, yeah, Alva's only real strength is that she can remove, mass remove seal. She still has not been, unlike practically every other character in this list, she has kind of an outdated kit, underpowered numbers, especially given she was supposed to be the most offensive character in the game, the Warden of Wardens, so to speak. But now her Exalt shield and her shield cards have really disappointing scalings compared to some of the year 2 Wardens. She already wasn't that amazing during the Arc 1 era, and unlike most of the characters, she hasn't gotten a single buff or mini rework the whole time. With that being said, Arc 1 has only gotten easier since its days, and there are quite a few reasonably difficult fights where Alva's Exalt's ability to clear the hand of symptoms is pretty useful, especially Chapter 7. Chapter 7 and to a degree Chapter 8, but there isn't many difficult fights in Arc 1 which feature seal. Her main strength is probably her ability to mass dispel seal, but if there's no enemy that's really threatening it, it becomes a utility that is a bit surplus to requirements. Her early game is playable, but not an improvement over the starting characters, and it does not get much better from there. Her Phantasmal Dive is particularly bad. You can only really use her as maybe a gimmicky Sangha support, and I don't think that can make it through 45k dives because of the HP creep. I'll put her in the top of D-Slimed. Lily. Oh, Lily is a bit of a hard character to rate because she has a very good scaling with Enlightens, even more so of a lot of characters. Her Over-Exalt is very, very strong, but we're not really counting it for the purposes of this list. Her ability to, in the early game, her ability to shield and her poison numbers are quite impressively good, although she can have some issues with missing crits. Overall, she is a really tanky character, but no longer the most tanky, especially without her skills maxed, which I do think is a little bit insulting in a way. But nonetheless, it is the case. Her early game with an E1 is solid, but probably not exceptional. Like, She is basically a def res scaling defensive carry, which is a strong archetype of character in Arc 1. But I would say that you would probably struggle to pair her with just very awful or underbaked characters and have her carry through the entirety of Arc 1. But she is still a really solid character. The fact that she partially scales off max HP with the Endure mechanic is also very good, given that in Chapter 9 and the end of Chapter 8 you can build bonus max HP. Granted, as long as you do get an E3, and that's the thing, her E3 is really quite strong. So if you don't have, unlike some of these characters, if you don't have her E3, it's kind of like Kathigu, knock her down quite significantly. Overall, I would probably put her... oh yes, and about Phantasmal Dive, she is kind of a whale character. Actually, she can really decimate Phantasmal Dive, but only with extremely high investment on poison teams. Essentially, if she can't stat check Phantasmal Dive, it's going to stat check her, if that makes sense, which is generally her issue, but also her strength. Luckily, for the most part, she should still be at favor in that situation. I would put her... I think the bottom of A is a fair placement. A almost feels a little bloated, but it's okay. Oh boy, Uvhash. Okay, so if you've watched my channel at all, you know I love Uvhash. I play Uvhash all the time. But part of the incentive for making this video is people sometimes ask me, how is Uvhash as a character picking up the game, as a person picking up the game or getting into it? How do I feel about them? Would I recommend them? No, I would really not recommend. Apologies for my aggressive tone, but no, I would really not recommend them. Their early game without Overexalt is extremely poor. Their base damages are extremely outdated. The thing is, they are a strength scaling character. That's why they can put out incredible amounts of damage, because they scale off strength at a ludicrously high amount, and they also accrue very high amounts of strength. But until you get to that point of that being the case, their base damages without any strength, or even with only a little, are awful. Really awful. They have their Boil Blood has similar kind of damage scaling as Ramona's Queen Sword. It really, you cannot count on the base numbers of it. Even my level 90 Uvhash, if I do a raw exalt, with absolutely nothing boosting it, with all of the stuff it has, it'll do maybe like 1500 damage in Arc 1. It is really a laughable amount. So that early game performance is really bad. Now, once I did say that for late Arc 1, I assumed that you could or would get that would get that Overexalt. Apologies for my brain not keeping up with my mouth. If you do want to play Uvhash, which you absolutely can clear Arc 1 with Uvhash, plenty of people have done it, you will probably want to get their Overexalt, and their Overexalt, a couple Overexalt combos with a character like Feign to keep you safe while it goes through, should absolutely kill most encounters in the game. But with that being said, so I mentioned the end mechanic earlier with Winkle. The end and the breeding dissolution mechanic that is applied to the Chapter 7 final boss. These kind of tide effects, these negative tide effects, ludicrously nerf Uvhash. They nerf Uvhash in terms of increasing the required... Firstly, they increase the required Aliemus just to exalt, and therefore over-exalt in the first place by a lot. And apart from that, they make it more expensive each time, similarly to Arc 2. But most of all, and what is overlooked, especially the Ties fight, actually halves all effect of crit damage, which is bad for anyone. But for Uvhash is especially bad because they tend to have, apart from Jenkin, they tend to have pretty much the highest crit damage of almost any character in the game at any given time. So it's just a big direct nerf to Uvhash's damage output, and also the cocoon mechanics that are very prevalent on a lot of tough late Arc 1 bosses force them to tank attacks and spend more turns in a fight than they would like to, and in some cases than they are able to manage, I should say. Now, their Phantasmal Dive performance is okay. If you borrow a whale, Uvhash, or, well, not really a whale. I have one, and I've only spent a few dollars on the game. But if you borrow a level 90 Uvhash, and the Chrono Pendulum is very favorable, like the one that gives you shield each time you hit an enemy, Uvhash can actually be a good character for getting high scores. Although they also have a lot of Chrono Pendulums which shut them down and make them unable to play. Overall, honestly, based on considering all categories equally, I would put them in D-slimed, but just for the fact that they can do some impressive things and numbers against in Phantasmal Dive and stuff, I will put them at the bottom of struggling. And yes, I am dead serious that Uvhash is probably a worse character overall in Arc 1 than Pandia. That is not a joke. Okay, moving on to Helot. So Helot is honestly in a much better shape than Uvhash. Now, since Helot's mini... I won't lie, Helot used to be a pretty dire character, but that was like a year or so ago. Since her mini rework, her Lasting Loathe and Shattering Strike actually have huge base damage. They've been raised up to a modern level, which means if you use Helot as a damage dealer, even temporarily, a couple of her Lasting Loaves deletes every non-elite encounter until late chapter 7, basically. And her shattering strike as well is really powerful as long as you can play her relatively properly and stall for a couple turns. With that being said, so early game, thumbs up, like definitely a thumbs up. Early game, no problems. In fact, she's stronger than some limited DPSs in the early game. But going towards late Arc 1, she once again has, as with any character who can have issues with long fights. Now, base Helot does scale a lot with each turn, but she can also clog your deck over long fights if you're not careful, especially the ludicrously long fights like Chapter 8 final boss and Chapter 9 final boss. These are the fights that really test her. But even in those cases, you can also use her as a sub DPS or a support, given that she makes anything that is a strike have more than double final damage for the rest of the turn, which is it's an incredible supportive ability, which for certain characters like Helot, Catena, and Tinct tear them off a bit. But for the likes of Catena and such, it can give them a huge boost to their damage. Also, in Phantasmal Dive, she's been shown to have good performance, but it's only if you know what you're doing, and with Wailing, and usually with favorable relics as well. She can be quite a relic-dependent character. It's a little hard to place her because she does have such a complex history, but for her early game prowess alone, which I still feel is very, not even underrated, just unknown by people. For her early game prowess alone, I would probably have to put her... I mean, she's certainly a better character than Caecus and Arc 1 in my opinion, and probably G-Doll. I think the top of B tier is a really fair placement, because I do feel that she's overall a worse, or at least a more difficult to wring all of the playability out of damage dealer in Arc 1. Compared to those in A tier, but she's certainly better than those below. Agrippa. Oh, wow. Frankly, I do find Agrippa quite hard to place. Agrippa, I feel, has to take quite a big penalty, mostly because she is either... How do I say this? She mostly combos well with things that are generally found in Arc 2, or by having ties on the same team as her. Her 2 costs can actually be an incredibly good card with ties or maybe Pickman on the team. But in all likelihood, especially for the purposes of this list, you're not going to have ties and you're not going to have Pickman, which really harms her. In the early game, she does negligible damage, of course, and her shields are also not really up to standard, and her alert, without having a lot of levels, and it more so in Arc 2, her alert, which is really her defining mechanic, especially without ties, she just does not generate a good amount of alert. And if you don't generate a really good amount of alert fast, you're going to die to the very high damage output enemies in late Arc 1 and in Phantasmal Dive as well. With that being said, she is certainly still a better AFK character than quite a lot of those on the list. Her 2 cost, as long as you use her 2 cost when you have a high amount of embryo fusion, like 80% plus, it's a very, very, very good card, about equivalent or better than Ty's 2 cost, which is an amazing card. And her and you can do some useful things with her Pale Will overall. Yeah, she's basically decent. I would put her she's either here or I do feel as if she is, especially the time getting accounted for, I feel she is noticeably better than Aequor, but she is still just very rarely an optimal choice. Arc 2 is really where she thrives, and even then on very, very situational teams that you're very unlikely to have as a newer player. And this is mostly targeted at an account. And Phantasmal Dive, same thing, unless you have a crazy gimmick team, she just can't tank it. She cannot tank Phantasmal Dive. Liz. I don't feel 100% qualified to speak on this character, but I have seen, because I have only played her somewhat in Arc 1. I've played her more in Arc 2, and once again, she has a very good Soul Forge, which is a little bit concerning. And her posse is, oh my god, her posse is very difficult to get, actually, her personal posse. Because even the normal difficulty fight it's attached to is harder than almost all content in Arc 1. Now I think about it on normal mode. So you might have to smoke a few ecogs to get through that. And her personal posse is quite good for her. But anyways, to not sidetrack, her early game is bad. Definitely her early game is indisputably bad. She still suffers from poor base numbers. She's a very multiplier dependent character, as always. Her base numbers are low, and she has kind of a setup based playstyle, which really does not lend itself well to when enemies start hitting for, even with Gluttony, which you should always be using for most of your Arc 1 play. Even with Gluttony, enemies start doing about half of your max health a hit. Or at least per turn, and it's not really favorable to her. With that being said, the fact that she can do with the right setup, and being admittedly sometimes carried a little through some mob fights and such, the fact that she can do a large amount of pierce damage and then apply a large amount of bleed can functionally either significantly ease or even bypass some of the more difficult bosses like Aisha, who become much harder after going into phase 2, or Ties as well. Overall it makes her a little difficult to place, but she is, based on the fact that she's a very stat dependent character, and based on the fact that, based on the poor early game, the kind of difficulty of setting her up, she really benefits as well from powerful wheels, and even wheels that you have to pay for, like Sunfall is a best in slot wheel for her, even more so than her on some other characters. Overall, I don't feel 100% confident about this placing compared to others, but I think putting her at the top of struggling is a pretty fair... It's either here or here, but I think putting her at the top of struggling is a fair compromise, just because to me, she feels a lot like Uvhash, except she is probably a bit better than Uvhash in most cases, in that she requires... she can do some things that are objectively strong, but she requires a dedicated team and fitting a play style around her in a way that Helot, Catena... Well, never mind. Okay. Helot, Catena, and Castor are unfair. In a way that, say, Jenkin and Helot original really don't require that kind of jumping through hoops for. Pollux. Oh my god. Okay, Pollux is one of my favorite characters from a gameplay purview, and is also one of the hardest characters to evaluate in terms of strength in the game. Now, at the risk of sounding like a goddamn broken cassette, Pollux also has a very strong Soul Forge. They do noticeably more damage in Arc 2 than Arc 1. Actually, they do about double the amount of damage per card in Arc 2. So you'd think this means that Arc 1 must be terrible. Well, not exactly. Because the lack of card limit in Arc 1 is really very beneficial to them, especially when you incorporate some of the more ridiculous relics, like say Black Candle and Ritual of Omniscient Gnosis to just keep drawing cards. There's a lot of relics in Arc 1 which can massively extend your turns, of course, which Pollux benefits from hugely. So the first thing to get out of the way, even though their E3 is basically mandatory to play them, nonetheless, their early game performance is incredibly good, incredibly free. Why is that? Because the reason that's the case is because their atonement does not scale with skill level, it's just there. And it adds, if I remember correctly, adds a base damage of, I've forgotten now, it's either 100% or 150% of your attack. To your first card, in addition to the damage it does. I should remember exactly which number it is, but regardless, that is a much higher base damage number than most characters have on their nuke cards, and it's a free perk. So Pollux using their 2 cost with an atonement proc, or just clicking their exalt, kills most encounters for the entire early game. And for the bosses, which are relatively tanky, they just use a few cards and they're gone. Now once you get to late Arc 1, get to late Arc 1, Tiamat forbid, you might have to actually put in a bit of effort. And admittedly, I am a bit aggrieved that Pollux's OE is so good, and rather that their performance without OE is so much worse. And for the purposes of this tier list, outside of Phantasmal Dive, their OE is not considered. Now, I haven't extensively played E3 Pollux in hard late Arc 1 content, I'll be honest with you. But without having as much... See, the Overexalt not only gives you much more damage output, but it also gives you access to huge amounts of shielding, particularly with the Lone Seed posse from Chapter 7. Or Ties, if you have her. But the Lone Seed posse is amazing with Pollux's Defend to just get gigantic amounts of shield, which can actually tank some of the unreasonable damage output put forth by late Arc 1 and Phantasmal Dive enemies. But again, that is quite reliant on the Overexalt. Without the Overexalt, you can still use Sacred Heart's double play ability to double a defend with Atonement effect, and it is clunky, but it does work. Finally, just to be clear as well with it, now the fact that Pollux Bleed is an incredibly strong mechanic in Arc 1. Many bosses are extremely vulnerable to Bleed. They basically give you at least one free turn where you just get to keep setting up or bleed them, which Pollux does benefit from a lot. And finally, talking about Phantasmal Dive, if we're talking about their whale support performance, Pollux whale support in Phantasmal Dive, I can tell you, is one of the absolute best in the game, I would say, is easily on par with Catena and Castor. They, especially for a score like 45,000, they just have incredibly high base damage and base shields. But overall, it does feel challenging to rank them. It feels challenging to rank them, but in consideration of all of their skills, especially given that they don't rely on specific late game covenants as much as Tawil does, I'm hesitating between the top of A and the bottom of S, really. To me, personally, I feel they're the bottom of S, but I understand a lot of people do kind of struggle with playing them, which is somewhat understandable. Honestly, they do have a bit of an odd play style, and I do play them mostly with premium supports, but I feel like theoretically you can use them with, I mean, Ramona is a good choice. Even Faros, maybe you could do an Aequor ultra team potentially. You just need characters who can draw Pollux's cards and who are Arithmetica neutral as much as possible. This one's really got me stumped, I have to say. I am going to put them on the bottom of S tier, and you can shoot me if you like, because I do honestly feel like an E3 Pollux is much, much better than Jenkin is, just for clearing Arc 1 with great ease. But definitely also not really as good as these three aficionados. It's almost like a borderline tier, but this list already has perhaps too many tiers. Okay, so now we come on to Nymphia. This is kind of an interesting one in my view. I know I say that a lot, but so she did get a mini rework recently, but to be honest, I sadly don't think the mini rework affected her story in Arc 1, especially from more of an early to mid game perspective. In early game, she still has very low base numbers in early game, and although she can now output a lot more poison, it's really dependent on her having a good amount of damage amplification and, you know, crit rate and crit damage, like reliably critting to establish the poison. Otherwise, she is stuck triggering poison for other people. With that being said, she does have a fairly well-rounded kit, mostly with her Death Knell card. Her Soulforge is pretty strong, but it's not too defining. I would really say the main issue with her is just her early game. Her early game is quite poor once again, and it just requires quite a specifically built team to really make her excel, as opposed to a lot of the characters in the game that are much more plug and play, so to speak, like they can fit in a large amount of teams. With Nymphia, in most cases, I feel if you don't have a nice Lily to pair her with, it's not looking very good. But she is a lot better than her historical reputation in the game is, and she's definitely very good in Arc 2, but once again, this is Arc 1, and I would put her late Arc 1 performance as... It's hard to categorize. I feel that she can perform quite well in Chapter 7, but the fight, some of the 8 and 9 fights are a lot more challenging. It's overall kind of a lot of not so good news compared to good news for Nymphia, and especially from the perspective of a newer player, I would not recommend picking her up a lot. But she can still, depending on what limited units you have access to, she can work pretty well as kind of a well-rounded filler unit for a poison comp. Accordingly, I think this is a fair placement. I was considering bumping her to C tier, but she does have just quite limited team applications, unfortunately. Moving on to Rika as well. Rika is... Well, Firstly, Rika provides immense amounts of Black Sigil, and providing Black Sigil, especially on a flat basis, is very powerful. Relics make, the right degenerate relics make hard stages easy, pretty much by themselves, and almost all teams should be running Emergent Frenzy anyway, so Rika simply adds to that. The specific relics they provide are also generally pretty useful, especially from early game where you're often having some crit rate issues as well. Their coat can be quite nice. Octahedron Dice also provides fairly nice flat stats and has a chance to fish for vulnerable or weaken. I would say that early game is very good, mostly because in the very early game they actually do very significant damage. Unfortunately, by about chapter 8, their damage has already fallen off quite a bit, generally speaking, but it is still notable contribution as a sub DPS, so to speak, particularly in AoE fights. And again, you cannot call a character that can search for your deck, draw, and provides money. You obviously cannot call bad in any metric. It's just a question of whether you have a better option available. They are pretty much for most teams, they're a better Faros overall, with the caveat that Faros's Exalt does give a shield, even if the shield does leave some to be desired. Having a built-in shield on Exalt is generally quite powerful in the game compared to Rika's aggressively okay amount of AoE damage. I would say an issue with Rika though is that their unexpected gain card depends on you actually hitting crits with it consistently, which even in the later parts of Arc 1, with a not very built account, so to speak, can be surprisingly challenging. And I do recommend running things, you might want to run things like Crimson Pulse just to ensure that they can get those reliable crits, because unexpected gain really becomes quite a bad card if you do miss the crit on it. Overall, given their generally good performance, I think I like this spot. I considered putting them in low S tier, but I don't quite feel like they deserve it, only because overall you still need a good team and good characters to pair them with, because sadly Rika main DPS is definitely not going to work in chapter 9. Or, well, maybe someone will prove me wrong on the spot, but they just need someone to help provide that damage and benefit from their draws. Fortunately, there are a lot of characters for which that's the case, especially if you can generate additional arithmetica. Okay, so then we have Sangha next. Sangha is... So honestly, Sangha's early game is unfortunately very dreadful. A lot of people will have forgotten this, unless you've played her recently. But despite her being a good character in many ways, her early game is truly bad, among the worst in the game, because her cards cost very high amounts, and she simply doesn't shield much, nor does she do that much damage either. And frankly, with the considerations of the list I made, things do not get as better as they could. I did say that characters that require their overexalt functionally will be slightly penalized, even though I would assume that you could build it by late Arc 1, and Sangha certainly goes in that category. Sangha very, very, very much benefits from her overexalt, and she also benefits from strong Aliemus support to consistently get said overexalt, which is not always in high supply, as a lot of the best Aliemus supports are limited, unfortunately, like Horla, for example. And then for Phantasmal Dive, it really depends on the score we're talking, because Sangha can easily kind of wipe the floor with 30k difficulty, even 36k, but as soon as you add more HP beyond that and you like double or triple the HP of the mobs and the bosses, she starts having some noticeable issues with killing in a reasonable period of time. And unlike a lot of the characters which have, you would think as a shielder character she could fit in well as filler, but not really, mostly because of how arithmetic hungry she is and how much she also demands good death resistance be built on her. And I mean good death resistance because her passive scaling, which makes her strike and defense give more aliemus with the more death resistance you have, is an incredibly good passive with extremely high scaling. But it is something that you don't have the greatest access to until pretty much the end of Arc 1, because you really need Covenant upgrades and Covenant substats to get a significant amount of death resistance on your Burial Ground stat, which also impairs her effectiveness further. As it is, I really am stumped on where to put her. I feel like putting her in struggling would annoy some people, and I can't really put her in either great or terrible, because unlike these characters, I don't feel like she has she doesn't have a use case for me where I go, she is one of the best characters in the game. She is an incredibly good character in this case. But you can invest in her, and she can stat check. If you invest in her, she can stat check most content, and she only really needs nice standard wheels to make her powerful, at least. As it is, how do I feel about this? To be honest, the fact that she also doesn't really provide negative statuses, if I'm not mistaken. The fact she also doesn't apply any kinds of negative statuses as well, unlike Erica. Unlike Erica, or really quite a lot of characters, even Nymphia, does not really please me, considering how powerful and important those basic negative statuses are for most supports. So sadly, I think that is a fair placement. Goliath is... Okay, so Goliath's early game is really, really good. Although they're a bit outdated their damage dealing capabilities are not really good at all outside of early game. But in the very early game, if you use wheels, mostly rare wheels, to provide them sufficient aliemus to exalt back to back each encounter, their exalt cards, their 2-cost cards, can easily clear most of the encounters just by stat checking these very early game mob encounters, which is basically how things go until late chapter 6 at the least. After that point, their exalt becomes increasingly worse and worse damage, although it does still have a couple high points, such as during chapter 7 boss, and they mostly become dedicated to their large passive stats and their large amount of extreme damage multiplier from their exalt, which with certain tentacle teams, or just certain Aequor teams in general, sometimes Aequor 24 even, can provide really high returns on burst damage. They also have the capability, quite infamously with their E2, to temporarily steal all of the strength accrued by bosses, which the eyes do apply a lot of strength themselves. There are quite a lot of difficult bosses that at least use strength to some degree, which is hard to rate the capabilities of, to be honest with you, because for as many fights in which they're good for that reason, there's more fights in which it is a useless mechanic. And the Phantasmal Dive performance for high scores is not worthless because they still have the damage multiplier, but just quite poor. They're basically half a character, which is not really ideal. They provide that high nuke multiplier, but that's about the only thing you can hope for them to apply. In fact, in many cases, people literally put passive support wheels on them so irrelevant is their damage despite them being classified as a damage dealer character. But overall, they do have a pretty strong amount of attributes, and a lot of people do. If you just want a character that's very easy from an early game purview, I would recommend them as well in that regard. So I feel like the bottom of B is a fair placement. Okay. Alright, so we come on to Sorel then. Sorel is a character who is neither benefiting from the balance changes Brain of Vat has given her, or the parameters of the tier list in this case. Now, Sorel very recently got a buff that was very significant, but it was, say it with me, a buff loaded into her Soul Forge. They made her Soul Forge incredibly good. Her Soul Forge, with a wailed out Sorel, her Soul Forge can give 450 temporary strength, which, needless to say, is an apocalyptic increase to her damage, but that is Soul Forge, and therefore completely inactive in Arc 1. In terms of the buffs they gave to her base kit, they were almost non-existent. The only buff that is meaningful for practical gameplay, especially in the early game, is just her Exalt having one more base hit. And it is true that her Exalt should clear out most things, even without a lot of embryos. But in the very early game, she does tend to suffer from outdated bases. She is, as with Uvhash, she is very much a strength scaling character and a hit spam character, which is great, but without a lot of strength, and you won't easily get a lot of strength in the early game. Without a lot of strength, her hits all hit for very pathetic damage. This would lead me overall to declare her early game not especially good. It's also not terrible, but there is so many, like even Helot from Standard Banner, definitely. I've played both of them on a fresh account, and Helot definitely outperforms her. That is the original, not the Genesis version. Coming on to late Arc 1, Sorel has, even by modern standards, an incredibly good Overexalt. But having an incredibly good and core Overexalt to her playstyle means that her E3 performance, in my opinion, leaves some to be desired. The fact that she also she has numbers based on flat healing, which is kind of good when your keeper level is low, but also suffers from the problem of it doesn't benefit at all from Gluttony and from the pools mechanic in chapter 7, 8, and 9, which allows you to increase your max HP for the rest of the mission, the same way that characters like Salvador and Leigh benefit from this. And even like your Silent Sea shields from Aequor, Sorel doesn't benefit from it one jot. She's still healing the same amount per hit with her Exalt and her 2 cost, irregardless. Because of the fact I do want to be clear that the character is very good with Overexalt, especially in Arc 2, because Phantasmal Dive doesn't really play to her strengths either. But without the Overexalt, and this is a limited character, which means, even though you might get a copy or 2 of her off the Caro Standard Banner if you're lucky, overall that you are not going to get an Overexalt most likely with Sorel that way. So in the end, she does have some capabilities to be used in off support as well, given that her embryo generation is honestly okay, and she can kind of buff another damage dealer, but I do find that to be quite gimmicky. It's not usually better than even, say, Agrippa, which is not a great position to be in. She's just been dealt a bad hand in Arc 1, and it's an Arc 1 tier list, so overall, yeah, I'd probably put her here, honestly, which kind of breaks my heart to do, but it's kind of the placement that's got to be put. Although I suppose Okay, no, she is more bottom of C tier material thinking on second thoughts. Mostly because ultimately she can still easily... A lot of bosses which can be somewhat challenging due to their mechanics, even her E3 form can still just one-shot eating a few embryos, so it's not all bad. But nor is it good. With Salvador? Salvador is an interesting character to discuss. Early game Salvador can function really well as a defensive support, namely because they provide, they basically provide two guaranteed survivals, one from their temporary barrier with Rouse, which by the way, their Rouse, which is kind of mediocre late game, is very, very strong early game when you don't have skills maxed yet. And additionally, their End of Suffering ability to convert the Blood Furnace into a big shield is something that, once again, is not affected by skill levels, and therefore, with Gluttony, can create a really big shield once, at least, regardless of level. So you can use Salvador as an off support, and they're really strong in that regard. Salvador is also an amazing main damage dealer, although they do have a little bit of issues as a main damage dealer in the very early game. Because in the very early game, unless you have ties, you're not going to have the Lone Seed posse from the end of Chapter 7 either, which is pretty much a core posse to Salvador functioning well without ties. Without ties, they just have very low damage scaling, because their entire kit and damage scaling is based on how often they can play their signature 2-cost card, End of Suffering. And without the Lone Seed, well, I suppose once you get to Chapter 7, you're fine because of the mechanic of the chapter, admittedly, at least, but until then, for that early game purview, you do have those problems, but it's hard to say that they're, like, crippled or anything. That would be an exaggeration. And in late Arc 1, they are, in my opinion, the best damage dealer of all, even above Tawil and Catena. They make hard Chapter 9 ludicrously easy because they simply stat check it. Hard Chapter 9 allows you, with a good keeper level, to have ridiculous amounts of max HP, and Salvador has more damage and more defensive capability and healing based on the pure amount of max health you have access to and the amount of current health you have access to. This makes Salvador extremely busted, frankly, in any content where there's the pools, when there's the pools mechanic, which is basically all of the hard stages in late Arc 1. But they do, of course, that is somewhat affected by keeper level as well. So if you really speedrun it, good for you, although it does slightly penalize Salvador. And then finally, just to speak of their deep dive performance, their Phantasmal dive performance is good, honestly. 45k should not really be an issue for them unless your Salvador is very underfunded. You can also borrow them as a whale support potentially. A plus 12 Salvador is very nice. Their 72Ks can be a little bit of an issue just because they, unless you have a creative strategy, they can get a damage gap just because of the sheer amount of HP in that content. But for more reasonable Phantasmal dive scores, it's not a big problem. The only issue is you really might want ties for Phantasmal dives. Overall, I'm really confident to put Salvador in S tier. And I would probably, again, I'm going to put them here just because some people have struggled with Catena. You can't struggle with Salvador. You can't struggle with Salvador unless you'd have to fundamentally play them in a bad way. So, for example, just spamming if you spam their ability to convert Furnace into damage over and over again, then that would be trolling a little bit. Other than doing that, you essentially cannot go wrong on them. Dorsane is actually someone who really comes to mind in terms of modern characters having very bloated damage bases. Dorsane has a high attack stat, and their scalings based on attack, their raw scalings based on their attack are extremely powerful. Evernight Revel, which is the skill they get after using their Exalt or killing an enemy. Evernight Revel alone one-shots most of the early game. Even their one cost probably will kill most early game encounters solo. And moving on to later in Arc 1, obviously they have to put a bit more effort in, but they do have, they have very nice bases, even with low keeper level and a relatively underfunded Dorsain. You just need to make sure that they can reliably crit, because failing to crit on their quote-unquote nuke exalt, their third exalt, is the only thing that can really cause you a major problem. Being said, other than the sizable flat heal, they have incredibly negligible defensive utility, perhaps unsurprisingly, although they also don't, you know, kill you rampantly, such as Helot Catena does. As long as you bring basic survivability supports like Feint or perhaps Aigis, you shouldn't have too much trouble in that regard. Overall, Dorsen is a really good and easy to play damage dealer during the Arc 1 story. Even if I wouldn't call them the most broken damage dealer of their kind, they are still really powerful and really he's relatively difficult to mess up on, which is also an advantage. Finally, talking about the Phantasmal Dive performance, it's above average for a damage dealer. It's above average, but also not one of the absolutely face roll walkthrough kind of performances. They do need relatively better support compared to certain damage dealers like Catena and Castor, which can walk in with a really abysmal team and still do a 36k difficulty with a fair amount of ease. I think it's to me, they're a pretty clear top of A tier overall, and I feel confident with that placement. Oh, I'm glad we're on the final stretch now. Pickman is, once again, another modern character with modern... Actually, Pickman is probably the most hilarious example of modern bloated numbers. At skill level 1, their Chromophage does 30% attack, times 4, not including the creativity bonus, times 4 with an auto crit effect. Which is really funny when you compare Chromophage to, say, Uvhash's Boil Blood, which, if I remember correctly, does 13.5% times 5 at level 1 on a damage dealer. It's kind of a disparity like that, and accordingly, the fact that they randomly have a ludicrously overstatted base damage skill that they can often fish more copies of themselves does make them a really pretty good early game character. Oh yeah, it's also AoE. I forgot that part. Funny AoE. They also provide lots of strength. The only real issue with Pickman is that in Arc 1 is that from a low keeper level purview, a lot of the some of the most important Arc 2 relics they offer do scale off your keeper level. If I am not mistaken, they should work like that. Yeah, they absolutely would work like that. My apologies. So you'll have to avoid those and more so go for the ones which give guaranteed numbers, since they're just going to have a lot more effect compared to a low-level filigree Argate. In late Arc 1 as well, Pickman just really benefits from the lack of arithmetica and card count limits in Arc 1. It really benefits their playstyle, which is spammy and potentially loopy, depending on how things go. But they're not necessarily a face roll character, and they do have, in my opinion, especially with poor RNG, after their Chromophage damage starts falling off a bit without further support for it, an underfunded Pickman, like an E3 Pickman with some pretty shy wheels, can often feel like they're bringing not as much to a team as you would necessarily hope. I also think they are... I mean, you can just get around it by directly consuming embryos, but I also see them as one of the few few characters that has a Devour effect that is often not that good to play. Like, in the early game especially, I feel that 2 Arithmetica is not worth 30 Aliemus, because you should consider that a Devour effect functionally costs 30 Aliemus and a little temporary crit rate when you really think about it. All of those things in accord, you know, Ceteris Paribus, etc. And with a solid performance in Deep Dive as well, you know, especially from a whale perspective with pretty welled out teams. I don't like this character in Arc 2 for what that's worth very much, but for Arc 1, I'm lagging a little bit. I actually did not plot them in advance. I think this is a fair placement. No, actually, probably, yeah. Okay. Kasia or Kasia. Kasia actually is good early game. She has surprisingly decent base damages from an early game purview. Enough to deal with the double-digit encounter HPs of early game, of course. Of course, after the very early game, her damage basically falls off, except for some ludicrously convoluted setups. Unfortunately, Kasia is another member of the got a significant buff, but the main part of it is Arc 2 based. In Arc 1, even with the new buff, her Soul Forge lets her poof count as an aftershock trigger, like a pseudo discard, even though it doesn't. In Arc 1, that's not the case, which significantly harms her efficacy with certain potentially strong characters like Corposant, Tulu, Aurita, Murphy, etc. However, her poof is still a pretty good card, which raises up a lot of Aliemus and can be, as long as you have enough Arithmetica to fuel it, can lead to some pretty, you know, impressive combos and setups with certain characters. But overall, she definitely, with her missing one of her key utilities, she just suffers from being very outcompeted in Arc 1, especially given that she is ultimately a character that still brings bad stats to the team, so she needs to bring a little more than usual. But her poof and her telekinesis is still what I would consider to be unique utilities. Unique utilities, I should say. And she can have a decent amount of usability against certain Chapter 8 and 9 boss fights as well, especially if she fits well with their mechanics. It's hard to know exactly where to place her, but all things considered, I feel she's a bit more playable than most of the characters in this list, honestly. So that might just be my opinion, but I have found quite a few cases where Kasia felt like a genuinely decent pick, even with the lack of the poof buff. So I think bottom of C tier is an adequate placement for her. Daffodil. Oh, she was the second limited character in the game, I believe, and she's a very, very, very iconic character. Now, something that is unfortunate to say is that her early game leaves a great deal to be desired. This is because, once again, she suffers from old numbers syndrome. Her Skull Reaver or beheading attack has very poor numbers on it, base numbers, even with its ability to scale. With that being said, I would still not say her early game is bad by any means. She still has a strong and diverse kit, as well as Arouse that in Arc 1 is very powerful, and it is relatively easy to build a competent Daffodil Arc 1 team. You can pretty much build it just with a bunch of standard characters, honestly, which cannot be said for a lot of damage dealers. For late Arc 1, she should, as long as your team is being upgraded accordingly, she should still have absolutely no issues. If anything, in some ways, given that mob fights do not get that much harder, But boss fights do get significantly harder. This actually benefits Daffodil because, at least in Pure Ultra, Daffodil's quote-unquote weakness is the first mob fight or two can cause her significant trouble if she doesn't have a backup DPS or gets a bad opening hand, for example. There's just a high myriad of... even with... It is a shame not to have Daffodil's OE because it's so incredibly good. But even E3 Daffodil, along with Nautila, or even Pandia, got Tirama forbid, to dump the temporary counter into an incredibly high burst of damage, is usually sufficient to shut down most bosses in the game. And it's not as if Nautila is a bad character to bring regardless. It does a significant chunk to most bosses, and a lot of Arc 1 bosses are pretty susceptible to temporary counter anyway. My only real qualm with her is that, truthfully, I mean, it's certainly playable, but I can't imagine that her Chapter 9 final boss fight would be the best among damage dealers. As for her Phantasmal Dive performance, it's hard to rate because from a if you don't have an adequate team for her, she's really quite poor in Deep Dive, but with an adequate team, she's incredibly strong. Now, what is an adequate team? Basically, her OE and 24 OE can just pretty much just decimate every encounter other than the first one, which might require some resets. But that is not the most attainable team to make. Ultimately, everything in consideration... It's a bit hard to say. I personally think Daffodil is in Arc 1. Yeah, I feel confident putting her there. I definitely feel that Daffodil in Arc 1 is overall better than Jenkin, except in the very early game. And certainly if you are new, learning to play Daffodil is very good for your kind of fundamentals in the game and getting used to the game's mechanics. Finally, I have Wanda, a really interesting Arc 1 character. Wanda really kind of infamously got shit on by Arc 2, but fortunately we're living in the past here. So when it comes to Wanda's very, very, very early game, it's fine. Yeah, honestly, any Retaliate character is pretty good early game. She's not really the best among Retaliate characters in the very early game, but she's certainly more than adequate. Truthfully, you just need the ability to put up solid shields and solid counter conversion, all of which she provides, and there's an ample number of supports that can help her defend that are on standard banners, such as Nautila. In later Arc 1, with only having her E3, you do need to play correctly. It can be surprisingly difficult, mostly because her, if you have a level 60 Wanda, to a degree, her ability, it's not her counter, even though her counter accruing could be better. It's not her counter, it's her shielding. Her shielding is good, but doesn't quite go up as quickly as you would like it. In Arc 1, as characters in late Arc 1 as encounters start doing like 600 damage per turn in a lot of cases, that's when she can start having a few concerns. With that being said, generally speaking, the late Arc 1, although it has a few encounters that counter her, it's full of multi-hits, and as long as she can stack up her counter high enough, it's an automatic win. Her 10 stack Exalt in particular, because she has the complex Dream Guide mechanic, her 10 stack Exalt is also basically the best Exalt in the entire game. In fact, it's such a good Exalt that she's basically being held back because of the sheer power of this Exalt, unfortunately. And we didn't get a Wanda mini rework, and we probably never will. I guess I can't say that, but it doesn't seem too likely because she already got her buff. Talking about Phantasmal Dive briefly, she's very much a whale character in Phantasmal Dive. Phantasmal Dive favors offense rather than defense, and when it does favor defense, it favors stacking max HP with percent max HP base shields and heals, aka Salvador and Leigh and stuff. It doesn't favor Wanda, but she has done high scores and she will do high scores, mostly because there are a few dedicated Wanda players who are very, very good and also have a nice plus 12 Wanda. For doing a 45k with like a non-OE Wanda, I would never slot her, unfortunately, which makes me sad to say. In terms of her overall Arc 1 performance, it feels hard to place. It feels hard to place. I think a low A tier placement seems fair, because I know it sounded like I criticized her a lot, but ultimately she does. Apart from a few fights which are quite built to counter her, she was strong in Arc 1, and she is still quite strong in a lot of Arc 1 content, especially in the normal modes, relatively speaking. Oops, how foolish of me. There was actually one very obvious thing I forgot the whole time, which is because I went down the character list when adding characters to the tier list maker, I forgot to add Genesis Ramona to it at all, since she wasn't in there, of course. Now, Genesis Ramona. Okay, this is funny, because very early game, you're straight up not likely to have her, is the interesting thing, which can't really be said for any particular character in the game, apart from herself. But even accounting for that somewhat, I mean, you can get her by like chapter 5. So one of the issues of Genesis Ramona, which I actually should have mentioned, although it's minor, is that they are banned from being used in a few stages that are somewhat hard for lore reasons, which is kind of aggravating, although I wouldn't say is enough to affect their position on the tier list at all. It's just worth considering, especially if you do put a lot of skill resources into them specifically. So for Genesis Ramona herself, I think her early game performance is overall pretty solid on the rare occasions that you have her early game. She is a very underutilized character in general, and in my opinion, she is one of the most difficult characters to play in the game easily. In fact, if you aren't really keeping track of what cards you're playing at the end of your turn, which can easily be done even if you've played for a long time, you can mess yourself up a bit on her. With that being said, I do think Genesis Ramona's late Arc 1 performance is actually very good. She's a key flat and big strength dumping character, which goes very well with the very strength spammy playstyle of a lot of strong late Arc 1 characters, like Hameln, Riker, and even Tinct for crying out loud. Like her free cost basically inevitably gains damage. So in forced long encounters, she becomes pretty powerful. In addition to her general loop and negentropy mechanic is pretty well suited for Arc 1 in my opinion, especially when you don't have to, pay key flare to rouse like you do in Arc 2. I do consider her to be quite a competent character if played correctly, although she is noticeably quite awful in mob encounters. So I would preferably should use her as a sub DPS, which is usually her ideal role anyways, to have her either be the sub DPS or have her be the main damage dealer with a supplementary damage that is good at clearing encounters for her, since she is pretty much an anti-boss character once again. In terms of her Phantasmal dive, you'll only ever really see her in pure chaos, but having used her myself, I can say that she is a perfectly adequate replacement to Karin in a pure Tawil comp. In fact, I personally like her better, but maybe that's just my playstyle. I'm not saying she is necessarily objectively better, but she is a perfectly serviceable, strong pick that provides a lot of offensive support for pure chaos teams. And I'd say in general, pure chaos teams are her strongest suit, but she can also have quite interesting, noticeably strong combos with Catena sometimes, Pollux often, of all things, and there was even someone who used to use her with an Aequor G-Doll comp, just because any comp that focuses on key cards, much like Ramona herself, can make good use of Genesis Ramona. She has a very versatile kit and provides lots and lots of key flair. Really, the only issue is that you need to provide a lot of flat key flair for her as well, which can be a little difficult before you get Covenant substats. Everything considered, I consider her actually, if you just want to AFK, obviously play normal Ramona, but if you do want to play, you know, a bit more actively, I would consider her to be better than Ramona. I would put her, I'm almost tempted to put her up here, but I have to admit, on teams that don't really suit her, which is quite a lot of teams, and she does struggle with skill level ups a bit as well, I think top of B tier is a fair placement. I quite like this character in Arc 1, especially in late Arc 1 story mode, where she can just do a lot of crazy stuff if she's enabled by a dodgy character, like the illustrious Hameln, Horla, etc. Even Nautila. By the way, Nautila is a perfectly suitable fertility Orison support. I forgot to mention that. Okay, then we come on to the end of the list, and firstly, thank you so much for listening or sleeping through this, if you did. My throat is a little hoarse, so I'll just double check if I want to move any placements, like are there any I feel bad about. It did occur to me midway through the video that, of course, in Ultra, Tawil can steal Horla's stance by using her Exalt. By using Tawil's Exalt and getting Horla's cards randomly, and then it sticks around for the expedition. Now, it must be said that unlike most things, Tawil's use of Horla's stance is actually a bit less effective than Horla's because it scales off death resistance, which Tawil doesn't have. Well, she doesn't have that passive in general, so she just gets the base value, but it is still pretty strong, still pretty broken, if I'm honest with you. I'm not sure whether to boost Tawil on that basis. An Ultra Tawil team is like with Hameln and such, and this is like stacking quite a lot of limited characters on top of each other. I'm gonna stick with having Tawil at the top of S tier because although she's possibly the overall best damage dealer in Arc 1, with only some very minute flaws like her somewhat reliance on Dreams of Medication Covenant, just the fact that she is fundamentally a damage dealer when there is a ton of really good damage dealers in Arc 1, I think makes her slightly worse, in my view of how I personally perceive the game, than the game-breaking supports / utility characters. Just recording this quick note from later in the editing process. So I was differing over Tawil for a bit, and actually not only should she not be considered for game breaking, I put her too high in the first place. Now, the reasoning for me moving her down quite significantly is I realized it's been a long time since I played very early game on Tawil, and I severely underestimated just how annoying it can be to play Tawil sometimes with a dysfunctional team comp and with no Dreams of Medication, and not even the Chapter 7 key flare granting Covenant. Truly in the early game you have abysmal key flare, and this is most noticeable in Chapter 6, where in some situations, especially if you're not too familiar with the game, you can use time-strung pinions, play a few cards, end turn with no wings and just die. So definitely, despite all of her ridiculous strengths, I way understated the impact of how annoying this can be. And yeah, I think the bottom of S tier is more prudent because her and Dosen is overall a lot easier to play and get results on, and more consistent throughout the game, even if they have slightly less power at the end of Arc 1. Okay. So that is my full video. That is a little swan song to Arc 1. I mean, it's not going anywhere, but over the next few months, if you're seeing this in 6-9 months time, Aequor might have very different content or even a very different rule set. So this is of course dated to the 4th. Oh no, I let it go past reset. Oops, I missed a daily. Oh well. Dated to the start of the 4th of November. Okay. Have a good night and take care.